Hello. Hello. Hotkeys. How do we do the hotkeys? Should be good for now. Ooh, I can put a virtual layout behind me. I could set up a green screen, y'all. We could take these streams to the next level. Look, I got a brick wall behind me. How cool is that? All right. Now I'm hanging out with Jeff Young. Haha, that's cool. All right, how do I get rid of this? None. No virtual background. I can blur the background. Whoa, now it's just me. That looks freaking weird. All right, y'all. I'm just messing around. Hello, Eddie. Hello. How's everybody doing? What's everybody up to today? I just finished day 34 of Duolingo. I'm learning Spanish. Mi padre es un maestro de español. Pero yo no creo que hablar español. Nunca aprendo español. Estudio español 1 through 4 en la escuela de high school. In high school, I did Spanish 1 through 4. That's all I know. Now I'm learning it again because versatile. Thank you. Well, I need to be because I am writing the next Midwestern Marx book. Actually, not the next Midwestern Marx book, because I don't know what exactly we're going to publish next. It might be one of Giannis's books. Giannis Iqbal, one of our amazing writers. But I have begun the process of writing my own, which is a book that I've wanted to write since we started Midwestern Marx, right? Since we started our project, I've wanted to do this book. But now we have our publishing press up and running. There's motivation for me to do the book because I know people are going to buy it and people are going to want to read it. But basically, I'm just going to extend my undergraduate thesis. So a lot of y'all have read my undergrad thesis. We published it here. One sec, I'm just going to share my screen so we can go ahead and watch. Or go ahead and look at that. So a lot of y'all know I have my undergraduate thesis up on our website. And I also did a video sort of recapping what I say in this undergrad thesis, but it's about not just Venezuela, because to do a history of Venezuela and their politics would mean going really in depth and doing a lot of research and, really, I guess, doing analysis of Venezuela that I feel like Western Marxists should be doing of their own countries, right? Or like the kind of analysis that the Chavistas and the Marxists and the socialists in Venezuela are doing of their own country. What I want to focus on instead of that, rather than just the history, is how Venezuela is used in the West. So not only how the Western imperialists have targeted Venezuela and how they've lied about Venezuela and propagated this propaganda war about Venezuela, but also how they've done that, the strategies that they've used, and then how Venezuela has become basically the scapegoat. Where you see the banner at the bottom of the screen here. It says, "Oh, you like socialism? Well, what about Venezuela?" And I mean, that was literally, I had an economics professor tell me that. Like, if you like socialism, all you need to do is look at Venezuela. And you can, they were doing really well. They were a capitalist country. They were really rich. They had all these oil reserves, and then they went to socialism, and everything went downhill. And I asked this economics professor about the U.S. sanctions, about the U.S. surrounding Venezuela with their troops and intercepting various trade routes going to Venezuela, trade from Iran, and stealing the oil that was sent from Iran to Venezuela. And my economics professor said, oh, that doesn't matter. That stuff, maybe it affects the economy a little bit, but mostly it's just socialism. And I'm like, how is this economic analysis? Right? How am I in an economics class that won't even talk about economic sanctions, that won't even discuss economic sanctions? Because it wasn't about finding out the truth about Venezuela, right? The teacher just wanted to use Venezuela as this talking point, as an example of why socialism bad. And that teacher, of course, ran for office every year as part of the Republican Party and was the head of the local GOP. But that's a larger trend, and it's a trend that people on TikTok I know have noticed, where Venezuela has become a scapegoat in the US. You can't even consider socialism because Venezuela. You can't even consider universal health care because Venezuela. And as I pointed out in some of my work, and as I want to point out in this new book, Venezuela has a better rural healthcare system than the US. Venezuela gives better healthcare access to their people than the U.S. And yeah, the economic crisis, largely induced by the U.S.'s economic sanctions and financial restrictions, has hurt Venezuela's healthcare. But the healthcare programs that they've launched, training up new doctors and building new hospitals and doctors' offices in rural areas with the help of Cuba, have had incredible results. Incredible results. Whereas the U.S., there have been over 100 rural hospitals in the past decade have shut down because it wasn't profitable enough for them to sell healthcare. So we look at Venezuela, a country that's much poorer than us, yet provides better healthcare to their people. And we say this is a failure of socialism. So basically, what I want to do in this book is what I did in my undergrad thesis about Venezuela. Compare and contrast the U.S. to Venezuela. Talk about Venezuela as a talking point, and then talk about U.S. imperialism towards Venezuela and how it actually works. Do some more research into the sanctions. There's been a UN report now on the sanctions, an investigation into them. So that'll make it a lot easier for me to do my research. So shout out to the UN for that. But yeah, that's on the docket. That is what's coming up soon. People still pull out the Venezuela card in 2022, get new material. You'd think so, right? You'd think they would get some new material by now. But after I publish this book, they'll need to get some new material, because this book will put an end to that argument for good. Are you going to Cuba? Eventually. It is not something I have scheduled, though. Yo, thanks for teaching me at every opportunity. Learning a lot from you. Can you recommend a good video for those wanting to be introduced to Mao? For sure. Thank you very much. I don't know. I have a good one called Socialism and the Construction of Modern China. I have another video breaking down Mao's Little Red Book, Mao's quotations. Other than that, I don't know. There are a lot of good. I would just read Mao, though, because videos, I have videos breaking down Mao and his thought, but Mao was largely breaking down Marx and Lenin, breaking them down and making them understandable for peasants and for working people. So Mao's work itself is worth reading, and it's not that difficult. Venezuela, no iPhone. Mao ate all the rice. Stalin eats children. Yeah. That's basically how all the arguments against Venezuela go. I don't know much about politics stuff. I just would rather my tax dollars go to healthcare than bombs and guns. Hey, look at that. You hit the nail on the head. You don't even got to be that into politics to know that capitalism and capitalist imperialism sucks. old clip, but have you seen Vijay Prashad on Indian history? He pops the F off. I don't know if I have. Send it over. I still can't thank you guys enough for introducing me to Gabriel Rockhill. You bet. I can't thank Carlos and Mitch enough for introducing me to Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel Rockhill was like the final piece of the puzzle for me. You know what I mean? Like, I've known I was a Marxist-Leninist basically since I got into Marxism, because the people like Carlos who have been helping me develop, have always been Marxist-Leninists and have always told me that, and part of how I got into socialism was studying politics, right? And studying basically U.S. imperialism, U.S. foreign policy. And if you do that, you notice how bad the U.S. media is. Like, I was looking at the way the U.S. media was portraying certain events around the world. I'm like, they're lying about everything. Like, this is sheer propaganda. You can't trust a darn thing this media reports. So that made me skeptical of the stuff that they said about existing socialist countries, and that made me more likely to support them. And the more Marxism I read, the more I realized that, Lenin had Marx right, and the anarcho-communists who were telling me existing socialism's evil, Lenin didn't understand Marx at all, Stalin understood Marx even less. The more Marx, Stalin, and Lenin I read, the more I realized those people were wrong. And the more I realized, the classical right-wing economists are wrong, of course. Any pro-capitalist ideology is wrong the more you read Marx. But there was always those darn postmodernists in the Frankfurt school. There was always those postmodern neo-Marxists, or whatever you call them. Basically just the Frankfurt school, the people Gabriel Rockhill criticizes. Because these are like Westerners claiming to be Marxists, right? Saying we are Marxists. And we are in the academy. We are on the cutting edge of Marxism. We are applying Marxism to today's context. And then these professors, these Adornos and Horkheimers of the world, are saying all existing socialism's bad. The Soviet Union didn't understand Marxism at all. They applied vulgar mechanical Marxism, not real socialism. Every actual material working class movement is bad, but this is what Marxism is. We're not actually going to achieve socialism. All Marxism is good for now is just critical theory and just criticizing the crap out of everything and anything until you're nihilistic and depressed and you have no hope for a better world. Which is that's basically what I got from the Frankfurt school. But that always depressed me about Marxism-Leninism, right? Knowing that there was this group of smart people who called themselves Marxists, who dismissed all existing socialism and dismissed Marxist-Leninists as just simplistic and dumb. And, the more Marx and Lenin I read and the more I engaged with those Frankfurt school thinkers themselves, the more I was like, okay, I'm starting to realize these guys are wrong. I disagree with them on principle and I can argue against them, but why are they saying this? Right? Clearly, these are intelligent people. Clearly, these are smart people. They're in the academy. Why are they saying these things about existing socialism? And then Gabriel Rockhill's systematic analysis, giving a dialectical analysis of the Frankfurt School itself and how they produced their theory, and showing how the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, CIA, whoever else, in some ways directly funded these thinkers, but also just created the conditions for these thinkers to exist, right? Made it so you don't get a place in the academy unless you dismiss existing socialism. You can say I'm a Marxist, but you have to say the Soviet Union and China are evil. Otherwise, you're going to get fired. You're not going to have your job in the academy. And they also create the conditions where you can become a superstar intellectual by saying this stuff. Adorno and Horkheimer, and a lot of these other Frankfurt School thinkers, because they were being boosted, whether consciously or whether they knew it or not, they were being boosted by the CIA, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, all this bourgeois money. They became superstar academics. They became basically rich and famous off of doing this pseudo-Marxist theory. And, as Marxists, having a dialectical materialist analysis of anything, we need to look at production. So, it's interesting to talk about production when we're talking about theory, because theory is usually, considered more abstract and in our minds versus, production is real and material, and that's what we need to analyze. But theory itself is produced, right? So that's what Gabriel Rockhill shows, is this basically global Global Theory Institute or whatever it is he calls it, that is producing this pseudo-Marxist theory. So it's bourgeois money at the basis of production of this anti-Marxist, pseudo-Marxist theory. So if you look at the base, the economic base that is producing this theory, it's bourgeois. It's controlled by the ruling class, 99.9%. And that made the Frankfurt School make sense to me, right? Hearing that systematic analysis from Gabriel Rockhill, who's not just dismissing the Frankfurt School, who's not saying that's a bunch of stuffy academics or whatever. He went to the Frankfurt School and studied with them, right? He studied their theory as closely as intensely as he possibly could, right? And he basically came away with the Marxist-Leninist thesis intact, and came away with all these analyses of the Frankfurt School as being pseudo-Marxism produced by the bourgeoisie. And that was like the last piece of the puzzle for me. That was like, oh, that makes sense. Yup, I'm a Marxist-Leninist 1,000,000 bajillion %. I always have been, but this is like the last thing where I'm like, that was like my one last lingering question or doubt about Marxism-Leninism being, the best lens for analyzing the world today. And Gabriel Rockhill helped me get over that. So I know it's maybe not the work that's the most useful for like regular people or for workers, but for academics, for people studying Marx in the academy, Gabriel Rockhill is indescribably valuable. His work is indescribably valuable. It's hard to even put it into words how useful and how necessary his work is, and his criticism of the Frankfurt School, because that stuff is still being pushed by the ruling class today. I mean, also through like BreadTube and through various YouTube outlets, right? They're pushing like Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, and all this other CIA funded stuff, as well as like Adorno and Horkheimer and these pseudo-Marxist Frankfurt School folks. There's the clip of Vijay talking about Indian history. Okay, I will add that to my list. Thank you very much. So hopefully y'all have checked out our interview with Gabriel Rockhill. If you haven't, there's going to be some analysis of Rockhill's work in my book on Venezuela, because I want to analyze why American socialists so often dismiss existing socialism. But I got to pee really bad, but let's catch up on these comments here before I go pee. Hey, everybody. Hey, Where Pilgrim. I got my dad hooked on Rockhill. Now I think I might be curing the shitlib syndrome he's been suffering for years. That's awesome. Good for your dad. Your dad must be he must be like a teacher, a professor or something, huh? An academic? Or is he? I feel like if he's into the Frankfurt School, he's got to be. But you just have to point out, like Rockhill points out, actually look at the criticisms of the Soviet Union and China and whoever else that these people make. Because the Soviet archives, we have like access to them now. So much has been released from the Soviet Union. And there's a lot that you can only get, if you're in Russia, or if you're in one of the former Soviet countries, but because they only have physical copies. But much of that's been released. So we can look at what the Soviet academics were saying and the Soviet Marxists and the inter-party debates within the Soviet Communist Party. And we can see how complex and how cutting edge their understanding of Marxism was, how advanced their understanding of Marxism was. They were asking and debating the same, primary questions that Marxists have been debating and asking each other for years. They were talking about some of them way, way back then, even ahead of their time. So the idea that we can just dismiss that all as, not real Marxism, it's all just bad, especially when countries like China have launched the most incredible poverty alleviation programs ever seen in human history. So to just say, oh, well, their government's too authoritarian, we can just dismiss that all as wrong and bad, and they don't understand Marxism. It's so absurd. It's so absurd. It's so simplistic, and it's so anti-scientific. Yet that's what all these Frankfurt School theorists do. That's what all these pseudo-Marxist, indirectly CIA-funded theorists do, is just dismiss all existing socialism as simplistic. I'm above that. People actually building socialism, working class people and peasants actually creating their own society in the face of imperialist aggression. Who cares? That's simplistic. That's too simplistic for me, sitting in a French college funded by the CIA, talking about how existing socialism is evil from within the country, trying to destroy existing socialism with military force. It's absurd. It's absurd and it's condescending too. That's the worst thing about the Frankfurt School. Hey, comrades. Woo! Domenico Lacerdo is another one. Literally no attention. Oh, sorry. I skipped your first one, Johnny. That's like what they do to Grover Furr, dismissing his work because he'd been chased out of academia if his background was in World War II history. Yes. And I was scared away from talking about Grover Furr, from upholding Grover Furr's work, until I've actually now gone and engaged with a lot of Grover Furr's work and see how intense and how scientific his research has been, how evidence-based his research has been compared to most of his contemporaries talking about Stalin or talking about World War II. A lot of them just, cite sources that are not reliable, sources that are from like Western press or even from Western intelligence agencies like the CIA, as if these are just fact, and aren't biased in any way. Versus Grover Furr has done so much work. All of his books have a works cited list that's like 100 pages long because he's dug through the Soviet archives for so long, which very few Soviet historians in the West do at all, go into the archives. But he's been chased out of academia and he's had a bunch of crap shoveled on his reputation. So if I even bring up Grover Furr on TikTok, people are like, oh, quit talking about Grover Furr. Don't you know he's not in Western academia? Like, well, Parenti largely got blackballed from Western academia as well. If the more you get blackballed from Western academia, the more likely it is that you're saying something true. As long as everything's well researched, right? Unless you're just a conspiracy theorist talking nonsense. But Grover Furr's stuff is so scientific and well researched. Oh, thank you. Someone just sent me some euros. Is that what that is? Thank you for the super sticker, Ross. Much appreciate. I appreciate your support very much. Is that what that is? Is that 1.49 pounds? I'm in the U.S. I only use dollars. I only use dollar money, real money. If you don't use dollars, you can leave. I should start doing some kind of character. I should start doing some kind of like skits on TikTok where I'm like pretending to be a conservative. Oh, thank you for the $5. That's right, $5 in American money. That's what I like to see. Now I'll only answer these super chats. A lot of my leftist friends roll their eyes when I talk about the World Economic Forum. I get the same feedback when talking existing socialism. Oh, because people are talking about... Don't people think the World Economic Forum is like a right-wing conspiracy? And they say, oh, you're a right-wing conspiracy theorist if you think the World Economic Forum has any power. Like, it's literally just like a council of some of the richest financial oligarchs in the world. And financial oligarchs have all the power in the world. They control imperialism and most of the world's economies. And most people are slaves to the banks and to their employers. So it's not a conspiracy. I mean, it's a conspiracy to say that that group exclusively runs the world, or they run the world because of their race or ethnicity or whatever. They run the world because they're financial oligarchs. It has nothing to do with their demographics outside of that. But and then you get the same feedback when talking existing socialism. Yeah, I've thought before maybe it would be easier to, not support existing socialism or not be as hardcore anti-imperialist. Maybe then we could reach people easier. But you need to be anti-imperialist because the current stage of capitalism we're at is imperialism. And then you have to be scientific, so we have to be accurate in our analysis. We can't just lie because it's easier to convince people. And this big lie that socialism has always failed is not true. It's pretty easily debunkable. Socialism has been forced into failing the times that it has failed by imperialism. And we need to get rid of this big lie because, as I was saying with the Venezuela book, that lie that socialism has never worked, that socialism can't even be tried because Venezuela, is extremely harmful to the socialist movement. There's a lot of people who, if you bring up any existing socialist country, like, ha ha ha, you think China's done anything good? No, they're evil supervillains. It's like, what about their poverty alleviation programs? And people are like, what? I didn't even know they did poverty alleviation. Like, people don't even know about this stuff. So it's easy to debunk. It shows how much the US empire is actually lying to us about this stuff. And it's an important lie to debunk if we're going to get people to accept socialism in general. Like, you're never going to be able to say, yeah, socialism has failed every time it's been tried. It's been an absolute disaster that allows working people to get screwed. Let's do it again. This time it'll work. Trust me. That's a stupid argument. And it's not true. It's an unscientific argument. So, all right, I will continue reading these. I will catch up on the chats that I missed, and then we'll react to our first video once I get back. I gotta pee so bad. Opening up my wall. I have returned. By the way, everyone will be happy to hear this. Our buddy Carlos will be joining us later. So for those of you who want to see Carlos and I talk about philosophy and react to stuff, you will in a little bit. You also can't say Soros around these so-called leftists. You guys are right. You're hitting on something that's a big issue, is that there are people who will dismiss things that are true as conspiracy theories because it sounds like things that right-wingers say. It sounds like things that QAnon Trump people will say. So if you talk about like George Soros or the Open Society Foundation and how that funds coups and regime change efforts and propaganda around the world, people are like, oh, what are you, QAnon, right-wing Trump supporter? It's like, no, that's just true. It's not only George Soros, right? Or it's not some conspiracy that Jewish people are controlling the world, which is what a lot of the right-wing goofballs believe. It's just people with money. It's financial oligarchs, financial capitalists, and George Soros is one of those, and he's one of the most heavily invested in politics. He's sort of like the liberal version of the Koch brothers, where he takes the class struggle very seriously and has invested tons and tons and tons of money in helping his class win the class struggle. That's what George Soros is. And these I know QAnon people, and some of them are definitely too far gone, and nobody likes to talk to them because they always start talking about conspiracies and all this weird stuff, right away. And some of them are the kind of people who will never listen to you in a million years. But there are people who consider themselves on the right who just hate corporations and who hate George Soros and who hate the World Economic Forum. And it's okay to show them Marxism. Say, yes, this is capitalist imperialism, which stems from capitalism, which stems from the wage relation. We're all wage slaves to these banks. So, of course, they're going to run the world and do imperialism and change things up when things aren't going their way. And what we need to do is not, talk about conspiracies and vote for Trump and whatever else. We need to organize ourselves and take power as a class against this class who's currently in power. To be labeled anti-Semitic for criticizing World Economic Forum. Yeah, it's like, it's not the same, but it's almost similar to like people who will call you anti-Semitic for being pro-Palestine. Be like, free Palestine, like that's anti-Semitic. It's like, why? Because there's this group of people who says free Palestine and they're anti-Semitic. It's like, okay, well, I'm not them. My criticism of Israel is very scientific, and Sebastian, our buddy the other day, Ramiro Sebastian Funes, posted about how the Rockefellers helped found Israel. How funding from them helped create Israel. This isn't some kind of right-wing conspiracy based on the idea that Jewish people are in control of the world. This is just saying one of the most powerful group of capitalists among many, many, many powerful capitalists and financial oligarchs in the world of all different creeds, religions, races, ethnicities, whatever else. The Rockefellers are just one very powerful group, and Israel is an imperialist puppet state. Right? So there are tons of oligarchs funding money into Israel. There are evangelical Christians giving money to Israel. It's not just, this cabal of Jewish capitalists running the world as QAnon people believe. But, that doesn't mean it's a conspiracy theory to say the Rockefellers helped bankroll Israel to act as an imperialist state and kill Palestinian people for capitalist expansion, because that's what it is. As Ramiro pointed out in his great video. Ramiro's dope, absolutely. I'll pull up that video actually so y'all can see it. And because I just love to shout out Ramiro's channel anytime I can because it's so good. And it has so few subscribers. Like, that boy Ramiro gets shadow banned to oblivion. That boy has been shadow banned out of control. But here is actually the first thing that comes up when you search Ramiro is us. That's kind of cool. But where is it? I don't know how. Oh, there it is. Oh, it wasn't the Rockefellers. It was the Rothschilds. My bad. I messed that part up. Either way, shows how many giant banking capitalists there are. Lacerda writes about how Stalin wanted to help Israel in its formation. Israel literally long before Zionism that we knew. Today was as long before the Zionism that we know today was essential. Yeah, and I mean that's something that we've criticized the early Soviet Union for, is supporting the creation of Israel, but like it wasn't what it is today. Well, I mean the roots of Zionism existed back then, right? Zionism was forming as an ideology, but Israel wasn't necessarily this imperialist Zionist state. I don't believe until the 60s, when rather than the British being the main funder and sort of controller of Israel, it becomes the U.S. Yeah. Right-wingers will have an almost scientific analysis of capitalism, but then they have to make it about Jewish people and white G side rather than class. They don't realize they're obsessed with identity politics. That is a great analysis. Exactly. It's like they just can't make it a materialist analysis. Carlos is here, by the way. He's just his device is still being connected. I think that some of the problem is that the right say George Soros is entirely responsible for movements and grievances that they don't agree with too much, like BLM. Yes, and like Soros is funding BLM, But as you point out in this comment, but BLM stemmed from a legitimate grievance, right? BLM and the mobilization and the energy behind it stemmed from a hatred of police brutality, or a backlash against police brutality and police violence. And, you could even say the prison industrial complex and the militarized police force that serves them. It's not like George Soros just invented BLM out of thin air. But these corporations or oligarchs like Soros will start funding these organizations as they pop up and start controlling these movements as they pop up. So they have control over them, right? So they can gain control over them and use BLM to, say, filter people into the Democratic Party, right? So people have all this energy, they're mobilizing, they have something real and systemic that they're criticizing. So Soros tries to get a hold of that and, just use it as a way to filter people into the Democrats, an imperialist, right-wing, pro-capitalist party. So, a lot of these like movements that pop up and happen sort of spontaneously, oligarchs and financial capitalists are going to try and get their hooks in them and control them as much as they can and use them to filter people to the Dems or Republicans or whatever else. And, that's why spontaneity is inferior to organization over spontaneity. Like, that's why we have to prioritize organization, theoretical education, having a long-term strategy and a long-term path of struggle. Because if we just have these spontaneous movements, and put all our hope in them, in various spontaneous political movements and protests, it's going to be co-opted by the ruling class fairly easily. Carlos is waiting in the back. Carlos, just shoot me a private message when you're ready to hop in. Oh, there he is.
Hey, what's up, brother?
What's up, man? How's it going?
It's going good. How about you?
Good. It's been a while since I was on stream, so I am excited to be back. I was getting kind of anxious because we'd been keeping such a good stream schedule. But now I'm all caught up with life. Created a financial budget today, like a nerd.
Hell
And
yeah.
I'm ready to go. How about you?
Well, I've had the last week. I've been sort of preparing on and off for a presentation that I have going on this week. I had the first one yesterday, and then another one tomorrow. It's on the same topic on the 26th of July movement and the Cuban Revolution, and it's done with the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. We had the first one yesterday, and it was really really fun. There was a bunch of people there, a lot of questions. There was so many questions that I wasn't able to finish the last part of my presentation, but it's so important, Cuba, and although it has it's been able to create its own unique form of socialism that we can't like copy and paste here, as is of course the case with every other project. It's been really good at recapturing its positive, the country's positive anti-colonial, anti-imperialist history, and using it in its process of constructing socialism, of imbuing Marxism, Leninism with the unique anti-imperialist traditions of the country. And I think that that offers us a lot to learn, because I think that we can do something similar in the U.S., get the positive socialist, communist history of the country, and bring it forth as the historical legs of the struggles for socialism that we carry forth today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think obviously there's so much that we can learn from any existing socialist country or any revolution, but Cuba's interesting because it's so close to the U.S. It's just an island right under the nose of the empire, but also located in the West, in the Americas. So there's other similarities there between Cuba and the U.S. specifically that maybe there aren't between the U.S. and China that we can learn from, I think. And I mean, it's really cool that you've done so much work on Cuba now. Sort of because the history of your home country has been so tarnished, the reputation has been so tarnished by the bourgeois imperialist media. I think it's just cool that you're upholding the legacy and showing Americans that, you know, Cuba's an amazing country that's been battling imperialism. And we've got a lot to learn from them. I'll let you go in a sec, but I just want to say, someone said, Midwestern Marx, have you thought of just selling the Midwestern Marx patch so we can put it on clothing of our choice and items? That's an amazing idea. I just wrote it down in my planner. So I think stickers would also be something like that you guys could put on anything and hopefully would be pretty cheap. So yeah, I'll write that down too.
Yeah, that'd be great. I don't even know how much control we have over the like merch store that we have. It
Yeah.
was just some dudes that were in a co-op that offered to do it for us, but I think it'd be cool if we look over some of the stuff because like the logo, it's always a square logo. I don't think we have like the circle logo, which might look a little cleaner on some stuff.
Definitely.
But
I could
there's
actually
a lot
do
of stuff we can do, and maybe help see if we can bring the prices down a bit. But
right.
yeah, Cuba is so important, man, because in the '90s, when the Soviet and Eastern Socialist camp is overthrown, Cuba ends up in this abyss of darkness where the world thinks that the end of history is the socially unequal and superficially formal character of bourgeois liberal democracy as the end of history. Cuba ends up being like a lighthouse of hope for the people fighting for a post-capitalist society. Um, and you know, just the fact that it survived through the immense pressure of the blockade, through losing its central trading networks in the east, is just it's has great accomplishments, but its biggest accomplishment is in my opinion is the fact that it's even survived, right? Because if you look at the history of Cuba, as I always try to do, which is tracing it back to the colonial era, the imposed monocropping from the Spanish. And I do that for a specific reason because it shows that when the revolution comes about, it's not only fighting against the pressures of imperialism, so the pressures of the present, it's also fighting against the pressures of the past, right? History is weighing down on it. And the revolution has to deal with things that are not in its control at all, right? Like 75% of the arable land in Cuba is undergoing soil erosion because of that monocropping of sugar. You know, and its whole economy had been centralized for centuries around sugar. And it's the revolutionary government that first says, hey, we should diversify the economy. We shouldn't depend on sugar because it makes us liable to global sugar price fluctuations. If sugar's doing good, we do good. And then if it does bad, we do bad, right? Um, so there's so much that's often left out of the conversation, even in progressive like pro Cuba spaces. And I always try to bring those elements into the conversation because it just shows that look, even the fact that they have survived is a miracle. Like it just shows how effective socialism actually is.
Right. Yeah, Vijay has a good article. I can't remember what it is, Vijay Prashad, but it's like he basically says that Cuba has been the sort of beacon of hope for socialists in a lot of ways, especially with China's opening up and market reforms. Like people for a long time, including Michael Parenti and folks that are Marxist Leninists or supporters of existing socialism, have thought China was going liberal. So
Mm-hmm.
Cuba has sort of served as this beacon of hope. But Vijay's like, that is too big of a weight to place on this island country. Like if you study geography, you know, it kind of gives you an idea of like just how big the empire is in comparison to Cuba, or you know how
Yeah.
small Cuba is compared to even other countries who have tried to create socialism or construct socialism, and they're so close to the U.S. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they're a few miles away from Miami, Florida, the heart of anti-communism. And this is why the CIA was able to launch, you know, upwards of 600 attempts on Fidel Castro's life, because they're literally right there. Yet somehow, you know, despite the 70-year embargo, which is the most stringent embargo in human history, tied with that the U.S. has on the DPRK, and, you know, despite the Soviet Union, their main trading partner, collapsing in the 90s, leaving them isolated, they've survived, and
Hmm.
it's incredible. And I think why I like that quote from Vijay is like, it is incredible that Cuba's survived and that they've been able to construct what they've been able to construct. Um, but also, like, it's our job to bring them some backup, or to, take down the empire. Like, no more just yeah, Cuba's amazing, socialism works, let's hope we get more socialism in the future. Like, we need to create political and economic revolutions now to give this country some allies, or for us in the US, to attack the empire itself that has been putting Cuba under embargo.
Right. It's very easy to see the fact that it survived and some of the great things it's been able to do for its people and just lay off the fight. But the reality is that they could be doing so much more if there wasn't a blockade, and the difficulties, more specifically material difficulties that are caused because of the blockade, those would just be completely overturned if it was if the blockade was removed. And there's like evidence to show this. When Obama was undergoing the process known now as the Cuban thaw, where he removed some aspects of the blockade, Cuba had one of the highest GDPs in all of Latin America for those 2 to 3 years before the Trump era input again a lot of those sanctions and restrictions, which were, of course, a compromise for the Miami Republican community, the Gusanos and the far right in Miami, because Trump originally wanted to continue the policy of Obama, but he had to compromise there. But if you know that as soon as the blockade is even partially lifted, it wasn't fully lifted, but just partially lifted, uh, Cuba was growing at an immensely quick speed. It had one of the highest GDP growths in Latin America, and whereas in the US, like, GDP growth doesn't mean anything for regular people. It's just like a number that they tell you when the economy's doing good, but in your everyday life, you don't really feel it. In Cuba, GDP growth was felt. It was felt in the raising of the living standards of millions of Cubans. And when it was removed, they did a calculation of uh, how much, how much money was how much money was Cuba prevented from having because of the inputting again of the Trump uh, blockade, and it was like $9 billion. And when they calculated it for just those like 6 7 months, when they expanded it to have an estimate that's with accord to inflation for the last 60 years, it was somewhere around 1,300 billion dollars that the Cuban government didn't have because of the blockade. So yeah, it's the things that they've done have been incredible. But if we continue to fight for the removal of the blockade, they can do so much more.
Absolutely. People underestimate that. And I always try and make this point, especially like Americans, because we've never been under stringent financial or economic sanctions. There's so much consumerism and so many trade routes that go through our country, and so much that's produced here. But especially for a small island country, like, these blockades and these sanctions are devastating. You talked about the amount of money that Cuba would have had the blockade been lifted. That they studied, and the UN did an investigation recently into Venezuela,
Mhm.
into the economic sanctions, and it's 99% of their government revenue has dried up because of the
Yeah.
sanctions. 99%. And I like to describe it like this, because people ask me, like, what are sanctions? How is the US able to enforce these sanctions? It's literally the US surrounding a country with their military and intercepting any trade that goes through. It's barely, a covert technique of regime change. It's pretty well out in the open. And Cuba is surrounded by the U.S. Navy and U.S. military, as is Venezuela. The U.S. basically uses Colombia like a military outpost. Hugo Chavez called Colombia the Israel of Latin America. And so, like, a while back, Iran tried to send Venezuela some of their oil tankers. And honestly, I think we can take some credit for popularizing this story, because I didn't see anybody talking about this until we started doing it. Now it's like Jimmy Dore bringing it up. But the U.S. literally stole 4 of Venezuela's oil tankers and brought them back to Houston and sold them. That's just theft. That's taking the U.S.'s military and being pirates. and
Yeah,
stealing
yeah.
other countries' resources and pirating it. So these sanctions are devastating. They starve countries from resources, and it's more than just like a slap on the wrist, like the U.S. tries to act like it is. And then they'll say, oh, but we're not sanctioning medicine. It's like we're only sanctioning medical supplies, or we're only sanctioning Venezuela's oil, which they use to sell and then buy medicine. It's like, okay, well, you're not technically saying we're not blocking amoxicillin, but you're blocking them from increasing their productive forces, or blocking them from exporting, which will allow them to buy amoxicillin. Now, Cuba produces so much on their own, just out of necessity. But I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say else about that. We've got this video from Ben Norton and Multipolarista talking about the coup attempts in Venezuela that I thought should react to. But
I wanted to add that that blockades are also not these like fixed entities that exist. That people seem to think about blockades in that manner, but blockades are fluid, and they're constantly reacting to the reactions of the blocked countries to overcome the blockades. So it's a constant battle, and it makes it so difficult for a planned economy to have its plans constantly ruined by the flexibility of the blockade to move and in ways that make it harder for the reactions that the government had in order to try to overcome where the blockade was. So it's constantly shifting. And one of the other things is that, when the U.S. has a target that it is imposing a blockade on, it's never just a blockade. There's always what Vijay calls a hybrid warfare going on, where it's not just economic sanctions. It's not just a political game of talking about human rights abuses in the country, where there's, for instance, in Cuba, never has been proven that there's any human rights violation. And there's a bunch of people there that are paid from the U.S. with cameras, and they never capture anything. But it's a bunch of things. With Cuba, they've literally funded groups and individuals that have done terroristic attacks, like the Luis Posada Garriles and Orlando Bush. There were two individuals from the far right in Miami that worked with the CIA and that bombed a Cuban plane that killed 73 people. These people, none of them were condemned or sentenced, or nothing happened to them. Even worse, they're like heroes of the Gusano community in Miami. The leaders of the opposition that are here, they don't condemn them. They don't condemn these people that are literal fucking terrorists. They don't condemn them. So you have terrorism. You have the spreading of fevers and diseases to kill the livestock of Cuba, so that what it is able to produce for its citizens, it's ruined, which is something that they did to North Korea as well, right? Cutting the tail of the cow so that the cow tips over and it's unable to cultivate the land, which they used cows in the first place because they weren't able to get oil for the machines because of the blockade, right? But with Cuba, it's the same thing. They had those the spread of fevers, the 600 plus assassination attempts on Fidel's life, the funding of groups within Cuba. More than $300 million from American taxpayer money over the last 10 years has gone to outlets, media outlets, TV outlets, groups that promote regime change in Cuba. I don't think most Americans would be in favor of that. $300 million of their tax money going to regime change operations, right? And over the last 2 decades or so, it's been over $1 billion spent on trying to overthrow the government of Cuba. It's just absurd how many tactics that they have used to try to overthrow Cuba, and they're open about it. There have been memorandums since the 1960s saying that, look, Cubans on their vast majority support the revolution. The only way we can prevent this support from continuing, the only way we can try to overthrow the government is by starving Cuba. By creating economically desperate conditions, because then people might be open to the oppositional ideas that then we can fund. And that's been the playbook ever since. And what have they achieved? They haven't really achieved anything. They've achieved hard material conditions in Cuba. but there's been never any movement within Cuba to overthrow the government. You had the July 11th protest, which was the worst time Cuba ever had because it was a mixture of pandemic and blockade. And it was just a few hundred rats in the streets that dissipated as soon as Diaz-Canel told revolutionaries to hit the streets, right? So it's been an utter failure of imperialism. But nonetheless, like that doesn't mean that we can just sit around and romanticize Cuba and just let it keep on doing this fight on its own. We have to do everything we can to at least get Biden to do what he promised he would do, which is go back to Obama era policies with Cuba. He's continued and expanded the Trump policies on Cuba. So I think that it's definitely possible to get him to go back to an Obama era, especially now with the midterms coming about. We know how the Democrats are. They like to talk and do nice things right at the very end in order to politicize things and get people to vote for them. But yeah.
Yeah, you make some good points there. Hybrid war, Vijay's concept there is such an important concept because it always is, there's always multiple strategies that are being used at once or that are being layered. And it always, someone talks about inventing reality. It always involves a propaganda war too, in the US as well as usually in the country that they're attacking. So there's all these different methods that happen simultaneously, including the embargo, to infiltrate and destabilize these countries. And it's worked many times. Not every country has been as successful as Cuba in defending against it. But and to go back to what we started this conversation with, that's basically what my Venezuela book, the new one's going to be, is an analysis of the U.S. hybrid war. An analysis of the U.S. hybrid war, plus, the way that the U.S. uses Venezuela as a talking point to stifle socialist construction here, tells us not to organize for socialism because what about Venezuela? But other than that, it's an analysis of the hybrid war and the sanctions. Like you brought up how the sanctions are always changing. I've done a bunch of pieces on Venezuela now. Every time I go to the U.S. State Department website, it changes, and thankfully the U.S. State Department is nice enough to just tell you who they're sanctioning and how they're doing it. But every time that I go to research Venezuela, the number of sanctions that they placed on Venezuela has increased and it's changed. So yeah, it's fluid and constantly adapting to what can best strangle this country. Or like recently, the U.S. needed some energy from Venezuela, so they released some of the sanctions and said, okay, you can sell oil as long as you only sell it to us, so we can use it to wage a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. But yeah, let's.
And these actions are internationally condemned, by the way. A little bit less with respect to Venezuela. I think more people are buying the propaganda, but with respect to Cuba, every United Nations General Assembly vote over the last 30 years has voted unanimously in favor of the U.S. lifting the blockade. It's really only the U.S., Israel, sometimes Ukraine that hops in and votes against it. So we have, of course, the largest empire, an apartheid state, and a government, where fascists can do whatever they want and have a whole lot of power. So yeah, basically the whole world is in favor of the U.S. lifting this blockade, but yet it doesn't do it.
Right. Someone also says Parenti's Inventing Reality predates Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. That's correct, and Inventing Reality is a better book. So thank you for bringing that up. I just think Manufacturing Consent is a good term. All right, so this video from Ben Norton goes into the specifics of the U.S. coup attempts in Venezuela. I am going to play it at 1.25. I'll play it at 1.5 speed, and we'll probably skip through it because it's really long. But yeah, let me know if you want me to stop it at any point, Carlos. But I'm going to play it here, and I'm also going to run and refill my water, and I'll be right back. But
it's not often that U.S. government officials openly admit that they plan coups around the world, overthrowing elected governments. Now, there is a video clip that went viral of Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, openly admitting that he has experience organizing coups d'etat, and he criticizes Donald Trump, saying Trump is not competent enough to organize a coup inside the US, whereas he boasts, I have organized coups around the world in other countries. And specifically, when asked in a follow-up question by CNN anchor Jake Tapper, John Bolton singles out Venezuela. Now, before I play this video clip, I want to explain that in this video, I wanted to provide more in-depth analysis. This video clip has gone viral and has been reported even in mainstream outlets. But in this video clip, you'll see John Bolton talks about a book that he published, a memoir, in 2020. And I read through his book, all of the sections about Venezuela. And in this video, I'm going to summarize what he admits in this book about the many different US government-backed coup attempts against Venezuela's democratically elected government. So here are the—
Sorry, I missed it. Is this Bolton's book or Trump?
Bolton.
Okay. I knew he had done a book, but
these incredible clips, very revealing video clips from this CNN interview that John Bolton did. This is the former U.S. National Security Advisor for Donald Trump with CNN anchor Jake Tapper. And then after, I'll provide more historical context and analysis.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup. I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
Successful coups?
well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable.
so not only, and this is what I made a TikTok about this, not only does he admit to plotting coups, but he says you have to be smart to do it. Which is like Juan Guaido. That's one of the biggest international lol cows, just international laughing stocks in the world that this U.S. has wasted so much money on. And literally the last coup attempt in Venezuela, some of the people had airsoft guns. They literally didn't even have real guns, and they were stopped by Venezuelan fishermen before they even hit land. Like, oh, these are geniuses. But then he says, I've seen an unsuccessful coup, but Juan Guaido and the Venezuelan opposition, they're way smarter than Trump. Like, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, right. It's, how smart are you when the opposition that you fund, wherever they go in public, they're getting chairs thrown at them. And when you send mercenaries that are stopped by just everyday fishermen, it's absurd. And the fact that this guy can say that and not be in prison the next day shows that there is no real justice in the American justice system, because all of this is illegal. It's all illegal. And a country that's actually governed by laws and that actually follows its laws would have people like this in prison.
Literally. I mean, if it's almost like beating a dead horse at this point, because Chomsky has been saying every U.S. president should be in prison if the Nuremberg laws or Nuremberg trials were upheld, which is when they sentence all the not all the Nazi war criminals after World War II, because a lot of them were filtered into the U.S. and British State Departments. But yeah, I mean, these people should be in the Hague. People like George Bush is giving $1 million speaking or doing $1 million speaking engagements, or people like John Bolton. And these are some of like the most vicious war criminals in the world, not just indirectly funding imperialism, but like directly managing the overthrow of sovereign nations.
You know how dumb you have to be so that the opposition you fund ends up becoming like a global meme? Like, one of the best memes the Marxist-Leninist left has ever came up with are the ones where whenever something happens to a government, Guaido declares himself interim president. He's interim president of like 32 countries. Like, he governs half the world by now. But yeah, it's just ridiculous. Like, when I saw that, it kind of, I was watching Breaking Bad at the same time, and I was seeing Walter White just crumble because he wanted to get credit for being smart. And it reminded me of that, except that Walter White is perhaps a bit smarter than John Bolton. But yeah, big egos.
True. Yes, it's like when he's done all this hard work behind the scenes to overthrow governments. He's like, oh, I just want somebody to give me a pat on the back. He's too narcissistic to do it in secret. He's got to come out and brag.
But I think there's
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though.
I'm sure there is.
Well, there you go. Those are the words of one of the most notorious neoconservatives in Washington. For people who don't know, John Bolton was a significant ambassador in the George W. Bush administration and an architect of the Iraq War. And then he was brought back by the Donald Trump administration and made the national security advisor, which is the top national security position. People like Henry Kissinger had previously been national security advisor, also Brzezinski, the famous imperial strategist. And John Bolton was also the director of one of the most notorious neoconservative organizations in Washington, the Project for the New American Century, which outlined the plans for U.S. unipolar hegemony. After the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the end of the First Cold War, the Project for the New American Century really created this idea of U.S. unipolar hegemony, of the U.S. being the only superpower in the world. John Bolton is really the epitome of the warmonger. He is the archetype of the neoconservative warmonger in Washington. And he has never seen a war that he didn't totally embrace and love. Here's an article back in 2018 when he was first made national security advisor for Donald Trump in Bloomberg. And the headline, Bolton's worldview, bomb Iran, okay to strike North Korea first. Of course, people know the DPRK, North Korea, has nuclear weapons. But according to John Bolton, the U.S. should carry out a so-called preemptive attack on a nuclear-armed country. And he has constantly pushed for bombing Iran. Like I said, he was an architect of the Iraq War. So this guy is a complete unabashed war criminal. And I published an article about this over at multipolarista.com. All of the sources that I cite in this episode here will be available in this article. I will link to it in the description below. The article is titled, Trump advisor John Bolton admits planning U.S. coups in Venezuela and beyond. And I begin this article with the video clip that I just showed from CNN, but there are a lot of other details that I want to discuss today, including I read through his book, which provides a lot of information about the U.S. coup attempts in Venezuela. But I also want to show another video clip here. And in order to do this, I'm going to go through the history of the U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela that began in 2019. Now, I should say that that was not the first.
I just want to pause here before he goes into the Venezuela coups, because we'll probably have some specific things to say about those. But a lot of these concepts that we come up with as anti-imperialists, like multipolarity, which is actually the name of Ben Norton's new website, Multipolarista, come from the imperialists themselves. So, like, if you read the CIA documents that have been released, or that like Vijay Prashad uses to write his book Washington Bullets, they admit this stuff. Like, we are looking for a U.S. dominated unipolar hegemony, where we can they'll have fancy ways of saying it, but we want to have tentacles that control all the media, control all the education, so that ultimately we can control the economics, so that we can and they also talk about using, various financial institutions to do this as well, which is what Vijay does in his book, Washington Bullets, which I have back there, which basically talks about how modern imperialism works. And it's like the CIA and folks like John Bolton, especially with their documents that were private but have now been leaked or released, they'll say, openly what the imperialist strategy is, to create this unipolar U.S. dominated globe. So it's really useful to study that and, study what the imperialists are saying, study what their strategies are. Because a lot of times, especially their internal documents, will just state it out in the open. And if you look at like by example, the current U.S. proxy war with Russia, this is something that's been years in the making, right? The U.S. was trying to do a coup in Ukraine for years before 2014 when they were able to. And then since then, there's been an 8-year war in the Donbass waged by U.S. right-wingers as they've attempted to get closer to Russia and make themselves a threat to Russia. And, it probably would have commenced if Hillary Clinton would have won the election in 2016, but she lost to Trump. So we got Russiagate. Which is, Hillary would have won and we could have started war with Russia right away, but Russia rigged our elections. Isn't Russia bad? Don't you want more war with Russia? So these are sort of broad strategies that are cooked up in think tanks or cooked up by neoconservatives like John Bolton, which we need to understand in order to directly combat.
U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela. There have been many. If we go back to 2002, this was 3 years after Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary socialist, first entered office in Venezuela democratically. Hugo Chavez won the 1998 election. He became president in 1999. And then 3 years into his term in 2002, the U.S. government, the Bush administration, backed a coup that was briefly successful. But Hugo Chavez was so popular that the rank and file of the military rebelled against this U.S.-backed coup and put him back in power. Again, he was the legitimately democratically elected president. And there's a good documentary about that. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. So I'm not talking about that coup today. I'm going to talk about one of the many other coup attempts. There were many more coup attempts.
And that one's kind of an amazing coup attempt if y'all want to look it up. I don't know, Carlos, if you know, but I don't know if that's ever happened before, where the U.S. actually deposed a leader and then the people got out in the streets on such a level that the U.S. was like, okay, we have to bring him back, because the U.S. like literally brought Chavez back to Caracas after deposing him, but and put him back in power. But yeah, that might be unprecedented.
It is, right? The closest thing to it is Bolivia, that they were able to come back into power within a year. And that's still like, if it wasn't for Hugo Chavez, that itself would be almost unprecedented. But it shows how well they were able to solidify socialist consciousness in their population. But yeah, I mean, within a few days, they had to give Chavez back. Yeah, I don't think that's ever happened. Like, I know that they did a similar kidnapping on Manuel Zelaya, and they took him to like a forest and like left him there and they took him out through a helicopter. But there wasn't like the level of popular uprising that there was in Venezuela, especially not within the rank and file in the military. Which one of the interesting things about Venezuela is in part that Chavez had been inspired by the Peruvian, not socialist, but almost like left-wing populist. He could be called like a soft socialist. The name is slipping me, but in the 70s, there was like a left-wing coup in Peru, and the person that came to power was from the military ranks, and he had a training event that Hugo Chavez was in. And he ended up being very inspirational for Chavez. And so Chavez also came from the military. So the fact that they had that connection to the military prevented the conditions that existed in Bolivia that allowed the coup to succeed, which was the flipping of the military.
Yes, and the thing with Venezuela is Chavez wasn't even a socialist until 2005 openly. Like, Chavez is a great leader, and he was instrumental in the Bolivarian revolution, but it's really from the people. The revolution would have collapsed, during that coup if it wasn't for the mass grassroots support for Chavez. And there have been many times since then where the Chavistas, the people on the ground, have held Chavez and held the government to socialism, have criticized their own government and said, no, this is what you need to do. Because it's a revolution where the people have the power, not just this top-down dictatorship that the fucking lying empire tells us it is.
And the Peru guy is Juan Velasco. I had the name slip, but Juan Velasco. Yeah.
After 2002. But the most high-profile coup attempt was, of course, in 2019 with U.S. coup puppet Juan Guaido. Now, many of us at the time, us independent critical journalists, anti-imperialists, we argued that the U.S. government was carrying out a coup attempt. And some people smeared us as conspiracy theorists or Russian propagandists, all this ridiculous nonsense, these ad hominem attacks. Well, we now have one of the key architects of that coup attempt, John Bolton, admit that it was a coup attempt that he was involved in. Now, in that video clip, of course, he downplays his involvement, but we all know that it was the U.S. government behind that coup, pulling the strings. And his book says a lot. It provides a lot of information about that. But I want to provide a few other details about this. Now, in the article that I wrote over at multipolarista.com, I talk about how this coup with Juan Guaido began in January 2019 when the Donald Trump administration declared this very young, little-known right-wing opposition politician, Juan Guaido, was supposed interim president of Venezuela, they declared. Now, Guaido has never participated in a presidential election. Still today, he never has. He hasn't won a single vote in a presidential election, whereas Maduro has won millions of votes in presidential elections. But of course, the U.S. refused to recognize the legitimately elected constitutional president, Nicolas Maduro, and instead recognized this puppet, Juan Guaido. And
it's something where like Guaido is the head of the National Assembly because the opposition won National Assembly election in 2015. Even though Venezuela is a dictatorship who rigs the elections, apparently sometimes they let the opposition win. So then in Venezuela's constitution, he's like, if like Maduro and the next 3 people who are socialists were to die, Juan Guaido would take power. But the opposition doesn't have the National Assembly anymore. They haven't won the election, so it literally doesn't even make any sense. Juan Guaido is literally just a guy who the U.S. has now, is still declaring the president of Venezuela. It's such a freaking joke.
Right, right. And what's interesting is that the discourse that they use to talk about that, it's always like they always bring up the word democracy, right? Which doesn't really mean anything when it comes out of the mouths of these people. It was the same thing that happened with Guaido, someone that was unelected, that was 3rd or 4th in line. He ends up becoming president and then interim president in the eyes of these people, and then somehow that's democratic. Same thing with Jenny Añez in Bolivia. Like, her party had gotten less than 5% of the vote, and they just shoved her into the presidency. And the way that they're able to just play this off as democracy is just like next level mental gymnastics.
It is truly absurd.
The same week, on January 23rd, that was when Juan Guaido declared himself fake president, and the U.S. immediately recognized him, and the U.S. forced countries around the world to recognize him. That same week, John Bolton did an interview on Fox Business in which he stated very clearly that the U.S. goal was to get access to Venezuela's oil, and he said that U.S. corporations were in contact with the government, they were having discussions, and they wanted access to Venezuela's oil. So here's that video clip. Again, this is the same week as the beginning of the U.S.-backed coup attempt in Venezuela.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it.
So if you think of a company like Citgo, which is owned by PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company there in Venezuela, we have a lot of those Citgo assets right here in the U.S. Is that something, for example, sir, that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or in the case of Citgo here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. Venezuela is one of the 3 countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
So he's admitting that the goal of imperialism in Venezuela is oil, which is crazy. But of course, as Marxists, as people who have read Lenin's Imperialism, we understand this. We know that that's the goal of imperialism. But when what he's talking about there with working together with the oil companies, I remember I wrote about this for my thesis. The State Department literally just went to the largest oil companies who were supposed to, they had deals with Venezuela. We'll refine this amount of oil. We'll help you export this amount of oil. But because that oil is coming from Venezuela, they had to pay a certain amount to the government, which the government then invests in social programs. So it wasn't even, because these are multinational companies. It wasn't Venezuela saying this is all ours, because they didn't have the ability to nationalize it all outside of PDVSA, their state oil company. But they said, if you're going to be an international company, a multinational company making tons and tons of money off Venezuela's oil, you have to pay a certain amount of that revenue to the government so we can feed our people and make sure our people have medicine. And the U.S. said, of course not. We need 100% of that money. We can't just take these minor profits. We need super profits. And the State Department went to these oil companies and they stole Venezuela's oil. They took the oil that they currently had from Venezuela, took it, stole it, and then just dipped and then just left Venezuela, which is how they're now in a situation where they have more oil reserves underground than any other country in the world. But they lack energy because they can't refine any of this oil, because a lot of the skilled workers have left the country because of the embargo and because of Colombian and U.S. imperialist bribes trying to choke the country off from skilled workers. But also they don't have a lot of the equipment and machinery needed to refine oil, because the U.S. State Department went to all these corporations and said either steal Venezuela's oil and abandon them. And they did. And then the U.S. is over here talking about how Venezuela is a dictatorship because the government owns their oil company, or because the government works together with their oil industry. Like, we just told our oil industry to starve this country, and it's the government telling our oil industry what to do in order to make people poorer and hold back development and overthrow a sovereign nation. Is that not dictatorial? Is that not what a dictatorship would do?
Yeah, it's a completely it's a topsy-turvy world that they're looking at. It's completely flipped upside down. I don't know if they've ever been as explicit about their aims as the Bolton Trump administration was, and I think that's really the danger of that the financial capitalists had with having them on as the leadership of the country. The finance capital prefers the Democrats, right? And they're very explicit about this because they're smarter, they're more sinister, and when they try to attain their aims, they're not going to be as open as Bolton in saying that, look, this is good for our companies. We're trying to get their oil, and throw keywords, tyranny, democracy here and there. Like, most people are smart enough to realize that what he just said was that we need to overthrow the government of Venezuela in order to make it easier for American oil companies to cipher off super profits from oil in Venezuela. It's very easy to understand, but if you use the discourse of the Democrats of liberalism, it's much harder to decipher because they critique Venezuela, and they're not explicit about what they want. They say, look, Maduro is oppressing LGBTQ people, and they mix in wokeism in order to legitimize the attempts of the attacks of imperialism, and they're a hell of a lot better at getting the job of finance capital done and of monopoly capital done than the Republicans.
Right. The U.S. enforces sanctions, but like under the Trump administration, like we were talking about earlier, Iran tried sending Venezuela some oil, and the military literally took the oil, brought it back to Houston, and then sold it. So they pirated it. Normally that doesn't happen. Normally the sanctions are just enforced, or they're covertly stolen, right? The U.S. will covertly steal resources. But the Trump administration and that was under Trump, they just ripped the mask off imperialism. They're like, yeah, here's what we're doing. And then, of course, you have this blumbering dum-dum Trump who's just going to say whatever suits his own ego. He was kind of exposing a lot of what was going on behind the scenes, just like by accident. So, yeah, that's why they were sick of him by the time 2020 came around, or one of the reasons. And yeah.
Right. You always need the benevolent mask in order to convince people of what you're doing. And the Trump administration, a lot of times, they weren't really good at putting the mask on. They walked around and they showed the monstrous face, and finance capital couldn't have that. And so the whole establishment was, not that Trump was anything anti-establishment, right? But he and his group, John Bolton and stuff, are so incompetent that they were able to show explicitly what the real aims of the U.S. government is, which is the facilitation of the accumulation of finance capital, right? Letting finance capital through the U.S. state get whatever it wants from other countries.
Absolutely. Go a little longer with this video here. Some good information in here. Maybe one more little clip.
Now, in the original video clip that I began this episode with from CNN, the CNN Jake Tapper interview this July 12th, in that interview and also in his book, which is called The Room Where It Happened, Bolton tries to downplay his involvement and U.S. involvement in the coup attempt in Venezuela, but we know this is completely false. Bolton in his book claims that Juan Guaido organically declared himself president, and then the U.S. recognized him, but it was all the idea of the Venezuelan opposition. And throughout his book, he writes opposition with a capital O, like God, like he loves the Venezuelan right-wing opposition. Now, we know this is completely false from mainstream media reporting. Even the Wall Street Journal published an article the same week of the beginning of this coup attempt titled "Pence Pledged U.S. Backing Before Venezuela Opposition Leaders Move." And it admits that the Trump administration had a secret plan offering support for Juan Guaido. They said that it was preconceived and tightly coordinated. So in his book, which I'll talk about in a second here, Bolton lies. He claims that it was all Guaido's idea and the opposition's idea. No, it was directly planned by the U.S. government. This article was published in the Wall Street Journal on January 25th, 2019. It says, the night before Juan Guaido declared himself interim president of Venezuela, he received a phone call from U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. Pence pledged that the U.S. would back Guaido. That late night call set in motion a plan that had been developed in secret over the preceding several weeks, accompanied by talks between U.S. officials, allies, lawmakers, and key Venezuelan opposition figures, including Guaido himself. And they note that Guaido declared himself fake interim president and, quote, almost instantly, just as Mr. Pence had promised, President Trump issued a statement recognizing Mr. Guaido as the country's rightful leader. Soon after came similar pronouncements from Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and others. Now, we know this is because the U.S. planned this coup. It was not organic. It was not Juan Guaido's idea. It was planned by the U.S. government meticulously. And John Bolton was one of the key figures organizing this coup attempt, as he admitted.
I think a good point to make here, maybe the point we can end this video on, is now we're figuring all this out. We're figuring out all these details as documents have been released and as, we've gotten farther away from the coup and the propaganda campaign around the coup. And we know it was plotted by the U.S. from the beginning. It was meticulously plotted by the U.S. intelligence agencies. And they maybe changed their strategy as they went, but they had in mind their goal from the outset: overthrow the Venezuelan government, control their oil. And there were people like us, as Ben Norton mentioned in this video, being called conspiracy theorists when this happened, for saying the U.S. is doing a coup or the U.S. is attempting regime change. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, what do you think? The media is that biased? Do you think the media is lying to you? Oh, you think, everything in the world is just done by imperialism and everything bad is done by the U.S. You're full of conspiracies. And, it's easy for some people to cower away when these imperialist acts are happening, because, you get so much backlash for speaking out against them. Then, a year later, after more information comes out and after a bunch of documents are leaked, or maybe 2-3 years later, then everybody looks back and goes, oh, the U.S. planned that. It was an imperialist act from the beginning. Now I'm against it. Everybody's against imperialism in hindsight. It's like, no, look at the patterns. Look at the patterns. When there's some sort of regime change-esque effort like SOS Cuba going on in Cuba, or like this coup attempt in Venezuela, research, look at the evidence, but don't be so naive. Don't be so naive to where if somebody tells you, oh, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, the CIA overthrowing the government. Well, why? Because they've done it repeatedly, over and over and over and over again. And every time there's been smoke, there's been fire. Every time there's smoke and it looks like a U.S. regime change effort, within a few years, we'll have leaked documents gained through Freedom of Information Acts or whatever else by good journalists like Ben Norton, proving that it was a U.S. regime change effort. The tankies always seem to be right about that. So don't only be an anti-imperialist in hindsight.
That's got to be my favorite ever Eddie quote. I wrote it down before you said it because that's what I was going to say. So I'm glad you mentioned it. But you're absolutely right, man. And the hope that we can have, I guess, is that there's a notable point where people get tired of being fooled, and of always only getting to the right position only after a year has mediated between the initial event and the leaking of the formal exposure of the information. And that at some point they begin to catch on to it. And I think it's happening, but with the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, it's been insane because a lot of people that you would expect to be able to just smell it as a U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, they haven't been able to do that. So I don't know. There's also the fact that, like, with the case of Russia, it's so unique because it's been so targeted for so long in the American psyche that, most people that grew up playing Call of Duty, like, the enemy in every game is Russia. In bad movies, the bad guy always has a Russian accent. Like, it's all over, and it's so ingrained into the ideology. It's one of those things that we don't know we know. That's how ideology functions. That's what our assumptions are. The things that we don't know we know, but that shape the way we come to know the world. But the best we can do is continue doing what we're doing, and we're always going to get called crazy. And then within a year, they're going to be like, oh, those crazy guys, once again, were right. They've been right about almost everything, if not everything. But it's just not hard. It's really not hard because a lot of the time they use the same textbook strategies, and they just apply it to different places. Like, we know the bullshit rhetoric of human rights abuses, of abuses of democracy, if they're not democratic. Like, we know the game that they play. That's why it's so easy to call it out. but just people don't get it, right? And I think that the most important thing we could do is not just show them the facts that show that they're wrong or that it is a US-backed event going on, but give them the method through which we're able to figure that out, right? And that's what's different between perhaps like some of the journalists that provide the information, that provide a lot of the facts, and they do a really good job in doing that, and educators that are trying to give you the methodological tools so that you could do that on your own, and so that you have the methods so that you get to the conclusion without having to, go on and watch it, someone explain it to you and explain what the position that you should have because it's the correct position.
That's a really good distinction, and I have that thought when I watch Richard Medhurst. I'm like, he's always on point, but I guess the difference between, and I love Richard's work and it's extremely important, but I guess the difference between what he does and what we do is we're trying to get you to not just look at imperialism, but then go read Lenin's imperialism, or read Marx, or understand why it is that imperialism happens, what specifically capitalist imperialism is. And yeah, like people say, why do you guys read all these ancient books from so long ago? Why don't you read any modern books? It's like, well, like you said, it's easy to analyze when there's a regime change effort because of Lenin's imperialism. Like Lenin's imperialism from 1917 still basically explains everything, still explains the imperialist world system we're in. So it's like, I'll move on to some newer books when I need them. And like, I recommend Vijay Prashad's Washington Bullets, which provides sort of an update of Lenin's imperialism. But, imperialism is still the base, analyzing capitalist imperialism using the method of Marx. So yeah, that's what we're trying to help people do, so they can, so that you won't just be an anti-imperialist in hindsight when your preferred journalist tells you to be. And I think let's go ahead and end this segment by watching one of my favorite videos of all time. This is Juan
The hostility
Guaido
against the Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido has had a new episode of violence. The leader was beaten and pushed out of a restaurant in San Carlos, capital of the Llanero state of Cojedes, while on a tour of the interior of the country to promote the electoral strategy of the Unitarian platform that supports him in the face of the 2024 presidential elections. A footage accompanying the opposition statement shows Juan Guaido being held back as people gathering around him and someone rips his shirt off. Accusations were made that a group of ruling party associates carried out the assault. It is the second incident in less than a week. In Maracaibo last week, a political act also ended in a war of chairs. The struggle prevented him from taking a walk that he had planned. In both cases, Chavismo leaders have been singled out as the aggressors. The parallel government said the group, which was associated with the United Party of Guaido, organized his party ahead of a planned.
Dang, so this happened again. I thought this was the video of him getting hit by chairs, but I guess he got hit by chairs and then later on it happened again, which they're saying it's the Chavismo people, the socialists, which I hope so. I hope it is the socialists who went and hit him with chairs, but I think it's opposition people too. Like even the right wingers in Venezuela hate him at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that they don't mention is that when they ripped his shirt, they were doing the napkin challenge from TikTok, where they rip someone's shirt and they give it to someone else for a napkin. No, but seriously, like, you know what it is to go out into the street as the interim president that you consider yourself to be, and just have people constantly throw chairs at you and bully you, and then somehow the U.S. still recognizes this guy as the president. It's insane.
It is insane. I mean, the chairs video is just like cherry on the top of the Guaido Sunday. Hopefully we won't have to hear from him anymore soon. Nancy Pelosi forgot who he was the other day. They asked her about Juan Guaido. She's like, who? Like, yeah. The person you said was president of Venezuela.
It's such a shit show. Like, look at how our president and vice president speak. Like, it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And then you look at China and you listen to Xi Jinping speeches and you read them, you can literally study them and learn. There's so much you can learn from the speeches of socialist countries' leaders. And then if you listen to anything Biden says, like if you get a coherent sentence, you're lucky. It's the signals of moribund imperialism in decay, where the leaders can't even formulate coherent sentences.
Yes. And it's to the point where it's like embarrassing. Or
Yeah.
even with like, you know, Putin's not a socialist, but I hear him talk and I'm like, how is the really like the face, and not that this matters, you know, we know who really runs our country, you know, the capitalist, but like the face of our country is this guy who can't form a sentence. He's got like dementia, his brain is melting. Like our country just appears so weak even on the global stage. It's absolutely reflective of the empire in decay.
Yeah, but Kamala Harris, I mean, she doesn't have dementia, and I don't know what's going on. She can't make coherent sentences, and that's when she's even around. Like, she disappears for periods of a few months where no one knows where the hell she is. And the new Speaker of the House, like they just asked him a question about removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list, and these are like, I mean, again, they're forced into these really weird mental gymnastics because there really are no reasons behind the policies, no rational ones at least. But you hear them speak, and it's like, is this what like should be leading a country, any country, just a country at all? It's just insane.
Right. I almost feel like that's a way I've been able to get people to be anti-imperialist more. I'm like, look at what Biden is saying. And I'll tell them, like, watch Putin's speech about Ukraine and the Russian special military operation, then watch what Biden has said about it. You know, it'll just be obvious. You'll be like, wow, you know, maybe the U.S. is doing the right thing, but their leaders sure don't seem like they know what they're doing. You know, they seem more dumb than that other guy.
Right. And that's at every level, right? Not just at the level of leadership. After the school thing yesterday, I saw an old debate between a follower of the Cuban Revolution who's he does like streams and stuff out of Miami, Edmundo Garcia. He had a debate with one of the leaders of the Cuban opposition, and it was like an adult debating a kid. Honestly, it was so embarrassing. The guy went with his real nice suit, but there is no rational argumentation from the other side. They're just not capable of bringing it up. It's just vague reference to words that they have conditioned people to react either positively or negatively to, and that's it. And the scary thing is that, you know, there's people in academia who claim themselves to be intellectuals and scholars and who read all these books, but they fall for it. They listen to these idiots, and they're not able to realize that they're idiots and everything they're telling you is BS, that they're inventing reality in front of your eyes to legitimize their imperialist agenda.
Yes, and it shows, I mean, you have to analyze everything. Like, you can't be an intellectual lightweight and kind of just take what a lot of people tell you, you know, like, oh yeah, that sounds true. You have to scientifically investigate everything yourself. That's why Mao says no investigation, no right to speak. It's like, because until you really look at something yourself and go to the evidence and give a diamat analysis of it, like, you're probably not going to understand it, because especially under capitalism, there's probably been lies perpetrated about every subject or field of study for years. So this is a cool video someone sent that I've been meaning to watch for a while. It's about the Venezuelan armed forces. So it says Venezuela armed forces, never be a Yankee colony. It's only 2 minutes long. And I have some other articles pulled up that I think will be good to talk about after this video. But let's just play this video real quick and learn about Venezuela's police force. It's not loading. That's weird. I mean, my Wi-Fi's got to be working. This video seems lit.
Civiles y militares, unidos el pueblo y su fuerza armada, garantizando la independencia venezolana. La independencia de la patria, mas nunca Venezuela será colonia yanqui ni colonia de nadie.
All right, that was cool. It's kind of lagging, but yeah, it kind of shows what we were talking about there. Chavez is from the military, and the fact that Venezuela's had the military on their side is part of the reason they've been able to prevent coups. But like the way, I mean, there have been criticisms of the military and the police from within the Venezuelan people, which we're going to get into. But their police and their military in a socialist country or dictatorship of the proletariat definitely doesn't function the same as the U.S. military. You know, it's anti-imperialist. They rally people, around defending their country from the imperialists rather than, going to get other countries and spread freedom and democracy or whatever BS that the U.S. has to say. And like the recent coup attempt was stopped by Venezuelan fishermen, right? So it wasn't even directly stopped by the military. Yeah, they brought the perpetrators to the police forces, but it's the masses of Venezuela who are like armed and trained and organized and prepared for these coup attempts, are prepared to defend their countries. And there have even been times where there are clashes between the police and between communists or socialists and people in the neighborhoods, right? Just regular Venezuelan people, because the people understand they need to defend the revolution and defend against imperialism. So you have like the organized police force and military against imperialism, yes, but then even on a deeper level, what really controls them is the organized working class, the organized working masses of Venezuela.
Right. The state is a tool, and according to what is the ruling political power and economic dominant force, it's going to work in favor of its interests. So when you have a socialist party in power, it's going to work to enforce. It's going to work to enforce that interest. And when you have monopoly capitalists in power, as you do in the U.S. and in other major Western capitalist nations, they're going to work to enforce their interests, which means that the way that reflects itself in the mass of people is that policing and the military here feels like a repressive force. Policing and the military in socialist countries, since they're from, of, by, and for the people, they feel like a force that brings about security, and there's this real fraternal relationship between these policing and military forces and the mass of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're gonna keep going with this video because it's just a hype video, but I did want to not Juan Guaido chairs. But here's like some of the stuff we've been I was talking about with Venezuelan people or the Chavistas clashing with the police. And some people will try and use this as like a gotcha against Marxist-Leninists. They'll be like, oh, you guys are Marxist-Leninists, but you support Venezuela. Like their revolution admires Trotsky, or like they have Trotskyist elements in their revolution and in their parties. It's like, I don't care. They're still socialists. They're still constructing actual socialism in real life, fighting against imperialism. Like they can have whatever sort of theoretical uniqueness that they want, so long as they're actually still building socialism. So long as they're not saying, we in Venezuela refuse to build socialism until there's a permanent revolution, or we refuse to come to the aid of Iran because they're not a real socialist country. Like that's the kind of stuff Trotsky would say, because Trotsky was a traitor, and only wanted power for himself and an opportunist. But that's not what Venezuela is doing, right? The main Trotskyist bent in the revolution is just like they don't want a military dictatorship. They always want the people to have power, rather than an oppressive autocratic dictatorship. So there have been various times where the Chavistas have organized against the police, and where there even have been clashes. And yeah, in that case, honestly, I do side with the Chavistas and the people over the Venezuelan police, so long as the Chavistas aren't actually like CIA infiltrated front groups, which we always have to be aware of because that's something the U.S. does. But yeah, and this just shows like the US will take like something very small, or not even something very small, but they'll take something like the clashes between the Chavistas and the police, something real, and something that the revolution is working on dealing with, and the struggle is continuing, or they're continuing to struggle against. And the US will say, look, there are clashes against the police. Maduro's a dictator. The police are his tool. The US needs to overthrow Venezuela. It's like, no, that's what none of the Chavistas want that. Not a single one of the Chavistas want that. They want to handle their own struggle against the police. But the U.S. will take something real on the ground, blow it out of proportion into something it's not, and then use it to try and do something undemocratic, do regime change. So I don't know if you have anything to add about that.
Right. There's been tensions over the last 2 or so years between the PCV and other, as you mentioned, Chavista socialist organizations, and the PSOV, the Partido Socialismo Unido Venezolano, which is the leading socialist party in Venezuela. I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I'm in favor, of course, showing solidarity with the Communist Party, and any repression that they might be undergoing, I'm against. But we have to know the place that we're speaking from, and it's like you said, it's very easy for whatever criticisms that might be legitimately given from inside. It's very easy for that criticism, when it's done from outside, from the belly of the beast, to be used to further imperialist propaganda, right? So that's something that we always have to be conscious of, because it's very easy to not just fall into the purity fetish, but also to forget where it is you're speaking from. Like, it's fine if you're in Venezuela and you're struggling for more nationalization of the economy, you're struggling against some of the ways that the economy is being handled that are not very socialistic. And that's fine if you're within Venezuela, but if you're using that as a purity marker with which to support or reject the revolution, or if you're using that in your discourse and it makes up half of what you say about Venezuela, and that means that, and if you're in the empire, that means that half of what your audience is hearing is negative things about Venezuela, right? So I think that we always emphasize 95, 99% of the things is positive about Venezuela, and in favor of overcoming the blockade and it's the imperialist pressure on Venezuela. But we're also conscious of the fact that there are tensions within Venezuela between communist forces and the ruling Socialist Party.
Yes, and also understand the CIA in the past has infiltrated parts of various left-wing groups in these countries. So like Maoist ultra groups who are already, have some tension with the ruling party. And the CIA will then, fund these groups and use left-wing groups to try and foment regime change. I don't think that's what's going on here. There's been tension between the Venezuelan communists and the ruling Socialist Party, and grassroots organizations who are supportive of the ruling Socialist Party have criticized this move by the police, which Venezuela Analysis puts in here because, they understand the things we're saying. They understand, the people who run this website, that the U.S. is trying to do regime change in Venezuela. So they need, real evidence if, there is a criticism to be made of the Socialist Party, of the ruling Socialist Party. They need actual evidence, and then they're not blowing it up out of proportion, right? They're putting this out there so people can read and see Venezuela is not a utopia. It's not perfect. There's a process of construction going on with many existing contradictions. But it's nothing like what the U.S. says it is. there's a lot to be learned from this, but I think the main thing is that even clashes between police and people that do exist are nothing compared to what the U.S. says it is, and nothing compared to what we see here in the U.S., where police kill people and get off scot-free. Yeah, here's another article about the Trotskyist influence on Hugo Chavez. If you read any Hugo Chavez, he'll talk about Trotsky. And yeah, here's another one about the permanent revolution. And if you want to read more about how Trotsky influenced the Venezuelan revolution, so like the point of bringing this up, we're Marxist-Leninists. We hate Trotsky. We think Trotsky sucked. We think his theory was bunk. I mean, Trotsky was a good revolutionary, but ultimately ended up sucking. Venezuela has Trotskyist elements in their revolution. We still support it. It's still a socialist revolution against imperialism. It's unique to them. It's the Bolivarian process. It's socialism and Marxism adapted to Venezuela's specific conditions. If the Venezuelan socialists and Marxists want, a little bit of Trotskyist character and they think that would be helpful, who are we to say no? It's our job to try and build socialism in our own country and always stand with them in their struggle against imperialism.
Right, absolutely. And there's it's not just Trotskyism. There's some Maoism that's influential. That was influential in Hugo Chavez's thought. I know Chris Gilbert, who he's one of the main people in Escuela de Cuadros, and he writes for Venezuela Analysis. And for Monthly Review, he's written about the Maoist influence on Chavez. Ultimately, as you said, it's a socialist revolution fighting against imperialism. Why would any Marxist-Leninist, regardless of the disagreements that we have with Trotsky, why would we reject it at all? That's just us embracing the purity fetish that we're constantly attacking other strands of the Marxist left for having. I understand their eclecticism. It's also the fact that you have to build socialism on the concrete conditions that you have and on the history that's unique to your country. So if there's like Trotskyite tendencies that predominated as the main force in your country in the struggle against capital and the struggle against imperialism, then you have to kind of pull from that, because socialism is always a creative construction unique to the processes and history of the specific country in which it's being waged. So we always have to be cognizant of that and not let the position that we hold to be correct, not let that become a purity fetish that measures whether we can support something or not, but always show solidarity with countries opposing imperialism, especially the ones that are proclaiming themselves to be socialists and doing genuinely good things to put the Venezuelan people as the protagonist of socialist construction.
Yeah, and one thing I've always said too is the Red Scare was exported to Latin America. So the Red Scare sort of started in the U.S. McCarthyism, but then through Operation Condor and these propaganda campaigns and mass torturing and killing campaigns as well, the U.S. was basically able to export anti-communism and McCarthyism to Latin America and spread it across Latin America, combined with the mass torture and killing of socialists in Latin America, especially in the Southern Cone. So there are a lot of people who are scared of socialism in Latin America, and there are a lot of people who are scared of Stalin. Who have been these sort of things have been made boogeymen forever. So by saying and from my perspective outside the country, this is sort of what it seems to be. Their Trotskyist character. They're kind of just like, yeah, we're anti-authoritarian, right? We don't want a dictatorship. We don't want a large bureaucracy. Everything stems from the people. And obviously that's what Trotsky said he was advocating for. I don't buy it, but that's sort of what I feel like the Trotskyists bent in their revolution is. We'll never become a bureaucracy running the country. It's always going to be people, the grassroots at the head of our socialist project. I know you got to head out here soon, Carlos. Oh, do you got to go now?
No, I was going to just do a quick statement. I got around like 8 to 10 minutes. But there's so many different like strands of Trotskyism too within the U.S. and in the West. Like there's of course the pipeline, the Trotsky to far right pipeline that's real, but there's also other strands that you engage with them politically and they agree with Marxist-Leninists on everything. They're really good theoretically, and then the one disagreement that they have is like Stalin. That's unfortunate, but the reality is that a lot of people haven't had the chance to engage with the information that that shows how a lot of the stuff, or all of the stuff that was said in the 20th, in the secret speech, in Khrushchev's secret speech, was baloney, right? Not everyone has had access to Grover Furr and to Domenico Lasordo and to the other key scholars that have shown that this ideology, which they've tried to hegemonize so much, that it's also based on phony things. I was going to highlight that comment too, right? The most ironic part is that a lot of the Trotskyites, especially the ones that end up rejecting socialism, they wouldn't consider Venezuela a successful example of their ideology, even though like Trotsky scholars like Alan Woods, he was one of the main advisors of Hugo Chavez. Yeah.
For sure. Great points. Have you seen the TikTok that we made about your purity fetish concept yet, Carlos?
I don't think I have.
Okay. Before you leave, let's watch that then.
Okay,
I'm actually
sweet.
going to run to the bathroom while I play this because it's 3 minutes long. Dang it. How do I... Oh, I unshared my screen. Whoops.
Oh, just real quick, someone also mentioned like the case with the anarchists. It's also I have found that like these ideologies, they function differently according to the geopolitical context that they're in. Like even social democrats, there's some currents that are like Boric that are not even anti-imperialist, but there's other currents of social democracy in Latin America that are very anti-imperialist and that function very differently from like the right opportunist Second International style social democrats that we find within the imperial hegemons. And it's the same thing with the Trotskyites. It's the same thing with the anarchists. And if you look at Nicaragua, if you look at Venezuela, if you look at some of the countries that have had successful socialist revolutions, they usually have a mixture of all of these different ideologies, of different radical left ideologies. And I think it's kind of cool to see that they're still able to, even though they have different ideas on certain things, that they're still able to come together and wage a struggle and attain power and construct socialism. I think we have a lot to learn from that because we spend so much time bickering about very small and unessential things, and people who are 95% in the same place and 5% in different places, they end up fighting and splitting with one another when in reality the most important thing that we should do right now is focus on our central enemy, on opposing imperialism and on organizing the working class and facilitating the process of it taking power. And I think that almost everyone who considers himself a socialist or a progressive is on board with that and could potentially be an ally, regardless of whether they consider themselves Trotskyites, anarchists, whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, an example this person brings up the Zapatistas, like an example of how things vary based on the geopolitical context and the time. The Zapatistas were greatly inspired and greatly inspirational on the Bolsheviks, the Marxist-Leninists, because anarchism, Marxism hadn't been popularized as much back then. It hadn't led to all these successful revolutions. And there were a lot of anarchist or utopian socialist tendencies. So the Zapatistas were trying to do a peasant revolution, and they looked at the Russians doing a worker peasant revolution. And they're like, oh, yeah, those guys are awesome. We like them. We were going to work together with them. And they didn't focus on wherever they had academic disagreements. They just drew inspiration from each other as fighting the same struggle, genuinely, a struggle to bring workers into power.
Which is itself like the Marxist-Leninist thing to do, like focus on what the primary contradiction is and unite around that. Like if Mao was able to realize that at the point he was in the Chinese Revolution, even the national bourgeoisie that didn't oppose that opposed imperialism was a revolutionary class, right? If he was able to do that as a result of the dialectical materialist outlook and realizing what is the primary contradiction and what is not, we should be able to also do something similar in our process of figuring out, well, what sort of groups can we have alliances with, and always have as the center what we consider to be the primary contradiction, which is, of course, imperialism.
Absolutely. Someone says Zapatistas consider themselves anarchists. I don't know, but this was in like the early 1900s. So I don't know what they consider themselves now. But all right, let's play this video talking about Carlos's concept of the purity fetish that he hasn't seen while I run to the bathroom because I got to pee so bad.
I think one of the most important new concepts produced by Western or US-based Marxists in recent years is Carlos Garrido's theory of the purity fetish. And I might be a little biased because Carlos is my best buddy and we co-edit this website. But for real, it's not like US Marxists are pumping out new theoretical concepts all the time or leading the world in Marxist theory. We're consistently lagging behind our comrades around the world. But this is a legitimately great concept produced in the US, and it's important because it's specific to the US and the Western left, or Western socialists. And the concept means what it says. Western leftists or US leftists fetishize purity. Much of the Western left looks at existing socialism being built in other countries following mass revolutions, sees them bringing millions of people out of poverty, teaching mass numbers of people to read, decreasing hunger and increasing food sovereignty, building collective consciousness among the masses as opposed to capitalist individualism. And the Western leftist analyzing the world and history through the lens of purity fetishism says not good enough. These countries aren't real socialism. They haven't abolished the commodity form, or they still have some private markets, or CNN told me they're a dictatorship. I think China and Cuba should abolish their state tomorrow and also somehow stop the US from immediately overthrowing them. Though the Western leftists never seem to be able to explain how that would even be possible. Because they prioritize purity and perfection over practicality, strategy, and actually getting stuff done for the working masses. Though strangely enough, these same leftists are often the same ones who will tell you to vote for the Democrats every 4 years. As if the Democratic Party, who oversaw the destruction of Libya as well as many other heinous acts, are pure or perfect. But no, the imperialists don't have to be perfect. They just have to be the lesser of two evils. Only Cuba has to be perfect. The whole country's bad because they didn't create a utopia while under a 70-year embargo from the US. You see how this doesn't make sense? And the purity fetish also applies to making alliances within Western countries, especially the US. I've had people tell me they would never ally with a Trump supporter. They're all bigots. It's not even worth talking to them. They're impure. But some of the same people who told me that supported my videos about the John Deere strikes that happened in the Midwest last year. And I hate to break it to y'all, and I don't know how many of you actually went out to the picket lines, but if you did, you would have noticed that a lot of those striking workers voted for Trump. Should I have left and told them that they deserve to lose healthcare benefits and take a pay cut because they voted for Trump? Of course not, because socialists organize based on class, not based on the American political circus. Mao Zedong said, as for the people who are politically backwards, communists should not slight or despise them, but should befriend them, unite with them, convince them, and encourage them to go forward. And we need a lot more of that today. Western socialists can't be afraid to talk to or ally with people who genuinely share our interests, especially when strategizing for specific struggles.
So there you go. You can tell me how I did explaining your great concept in 3 minutes there.
I loved it. That was excellent. And I also liked how you tied it to something that I've been developing. We've been in conversation about it a lot, but I haven't been able to publish any work on it yet because it's within the chapter where I deal with the concept in the book that I'm working on, but how it not just reflects itself in the geopolitical analysis of these folks, but also in the internal analysis, right? And that's really important because it shows that it's revolutionary futile, not only because it forces you to be in this weird position where you say, hey, I'm a socialist, but wherever socialism has been tried, it's failed. But wait for it, guys. You know, it's we, the virtuous West. We're the ones that are going to get it right. But it also, it's not just that which makes you revolutionary futile, but internally, because if the workers are not pure enough for you to organize them, then they can't be organized, right? So who the hell are you going to organize, right? Who are you organizing, right? You end up doing this limiting of the working class that ends up completely decapitating any ability to form a mass working class movement that gets to power. So yeah, I think you did a beautiful job in explaining the concept, both in relation to its geopolitical and national context.
Thank you. I'm glad. And I mean, the concept, I'm so glad you came up with it. It's sort of like Vijay's concept of hybrid wars, or any new Marxist concept that comes up. It's welcome when it comes. Because as I said in that video, we're kind of lagging behind on, developing new theory. So it's awesome to see that the working class movement is producing that again via you. And then it's just so useful to explain so many things we criticize, domestically and when it comes to imperialism. So yeah, hopefully some more people pick it up and start using it now.
Right. Yeah, and I attribute part of it to Domenico Losurdo. He has a book that is now being translated by Gabriel Rockhill, which is Western Marxism. Massimo Cientala had to read it in Spanish. But he goes through the division between Eastern and Western Marxism, and he depicts how in the West there was what I end up calling a purity fetish, that if the state wasn't abolished, and if the commodity form, as you said, wasn't abolished, and if all these different ideal aims weren't achieved, they would reject these revolutions. And he finds that, well, in the East, what were they focusing on in the process of constructing socialism? Sovereignty, being able to even have a state, which means that they had to do what? Develop an efficient state. You look at Lenin's later writings, they're all focused on how the hell do we do this, not just as good as the bourgeoisie did it before, but how do we do this better? How do we run an efficient state? How do we develop what in China would end up being called, through the works of Zhou Enlai, Mao, and Deng, how do we develop the four modernizations, right? How do we develop science, technology, military, security, production? How do we develop all of these things so that we can increase the living standards of our people, but also have the power to protect ourselves from imperialist attacks? So those are the concerns of people constructing socialism. And because of the purity fetish, we look at that and we say, they're not abolishing the state. They have this, they have that. It's like we look like fools when we do that. So yeah, I build on that work from Losurdo, but he traces that purity to Christianity, and I go beyond that and I say, no, where does that purity? It doesn't arise in Christianity, but it's in Christianity because it was in the debates between Parmenides and Heraclitus. So I trace it back to philosophy, and I use a lot of Hegel in the process of doing that sort of genealogy. But yeah, it's a concept that really helps me understand and tie into things that might seem like they're separate, but at the end of the day, that I think they stem from the same philosophical mistake of judging things based on this purity that's completely abstracted away from reality and the reality of constructing socialism.
Absolutely. I've had people quote like the really, really early Marx to me, where he's talking about like how under socialism you'll be able to be a fisherman during the day or make shoes at night or criticize in the evening. They're like, that's not China, therefore it's not socialist. They're not Marxist. Like, did you just skip everything else Marx ever wrote? Like, and you're like, oh, China doesn't have, not everybody in China lives exactly the way that Marx was putting out hypothetically in this book, very early on in his academic career. Not good enough.
And they're the ones, they critique Marxist Leninists for being dogmatists. They're the ones picking unpublished works from the 40s and bringing them up to a pedestal as the end of Marxism. This is it. They don't understand that Marxism develops, that after Marx and Engels dies, there's people that actually carry on revolutions with the mantle of Marxism and that have to adapt to different conditions. They bring about new developments in the theory, and that those are important. If you just leave it at Marx or leave it at Engels, you are cutting yourself a century short in the developments of Marxist thought. And ultimately, again, removing yourself from any capacity to organize successfully for socialism today.
Yes, Johnny dialectically makes another good point. There's more than Marx now. There's Fanon, Amin, Losurdo, Desai. It's a science that's been developed. Yeah, and Rockhill explains it really well as like a living, breathing science for,
Mhm.
alleviating the ills of human society and of human production, and alleviating these things like poverty and lack of healthcare and, other material wants. And
I
yeah,
like
it's
that you
been developed.
mentioned. Sorry.
I was just gonna say it's been developed so far beyond Marx now. It's like if you're only reading Marx and then basing judging every existing socialism off that, of course they're not going to meet that because the science has developed so much further than that, as Marx knew it would.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the more interesting developments, it's we were just talking about with reference to Venezuela and some of the other targets of American imperialism, the discourse of human rights and how it's so central in the mask of American imperialism and legitimizing its activities. And I think one of the better currents developing specifically out of China, but there's people in the West like Radhika Desai, like Carlos Martinez, like Danny Haifang, Roland Bohr, who are writing on it, is the Marxist approach to human rights, right? The difference between concrete universal human rights and abstract universal human rights or rooted universal human rights. And Radhika Desai just published an excellent paper on the democracy and human rights of imperialism and the imperialism of democracy and human rights for international critical thought, as well as Carlos Martinez and Danny Haifang, who also, and Roland Bohr, who also in the recent issue wrote really good papers on the Marxist theory of human rights and critiquing the hypocritical nature of how the U.S. talks about human rights and human rights abuses. So, but yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you, brother. I have to go now, and it's always great talking to you. I hope we can get another stream maybe Friday or Sunday. I've been dying to react to the China videos with you because
Oh my gosh.
as soon as I saw them, I've been like set on at some point in my life moving to China.
Yeah, I'm so pumped to watch those. We've been planning on doing that forever, but now the chat has something to look forward to.
Yeah. All right, brother. Take care.
Yes, you too. Thanks for coming on.
See you, folks.
What China videos? Some videos about what life is like in China and comparing even like the poorest cities in China to the poorest city or to the poorest cities in China to like the richest cities in the US. And it's like because of China's poverty alleviation and because of the fact that they don't have income inequality the same way we do, their cities just look different. So even in the wealthiest cities in the US, like LA, or New York, you have homeless people everywhere because there are rich people, there are corporations who own the skyscrapers. Yes, but then there are, there's the other side of that. There's the antithesis of that. There's people who don't make enough to afford housing. So there's homeless people, and there's people living on the streets, and people in really destitute conditions and crumbling infrastructure. Whereas China has, made sure that everybody in their country is out of poverty and every city is at least somewhat developed to the point where people are getting what they need, the basic necessities. So you have even the most rundown, rundown, or even the most, the least lavish, luxurious cities in China look better than like LA, the richest cities in the US. It's crazy. It's like China every day is showing in reality more and more why socialism is superior to capitalism. And one thing I wanted to say, I wish I could have said this when Carlos was still here because I'd like to hear his opinion on it. But like we've talked about these new concepts that are coming out of the Western left now, or that have now just started coming out of the Western left, like Carlos's concept of the purity fetish, or folks like Radhika Desai. I think Desai is based in Canada, Danny Haifang. But these new theoretical concepts and these advancements in Marxist theory coming out of the West, or coming out of North America, which hasn't happened in a while because we haven't had a revolutionary working class movement, right? We've had Red Scare, McCarthyism have chased communism out of the U.S. Most people in the U.S. believe socialism and communism are evil, and they failed every time. But now, as conditions in the empire are getting worse and as the empire is losing its global hegemony, a real revolutionary, real working class mass movement is building in the US. And you have these intelligent academics, these intelligent revolutionary thinkers like Carlos, who are now throwing themselves into the struggle and who are creating new Marxist concepts that are useful for us today. And this is only going to happen more, as the struggle continues. It's like looking at things scientifically, as the mass movement grows, the theory that's produced by that mass movement is also going to grow. And this shows, one, why Carlos and I spend so much time looking at Marxists and academics from other countries, because they're oftentimes academics who have actually participated in mass movements or who have, gone to existing socialist countries and studied their revolutions. Basically, in China and in the global South, there have been actual revolutionary movements continually producing theory and continually advancing Marxism and adapting Marxism to our current conditions and their specific geographical conditions. And now, as the revolutionary movement builds and grows in the U.S. And in North America, we can produce our own theoretical concepts. And as is the case with Carlos's concept of the purity fetish, we can produce concepts which are specific to our geographical conditions and specific to our time period. So the purity fetish is a direct criticism or a direct analysis of the Western left, or of the U.S. left, even more specifically. That's something that, a Marxist in China would have a really, really hard time producing, because he's not studying, he's not in the U.S. struggle all the time. So yeah, there's a need for unique theoretical observations and unique theoretical analysis for every movement. And I think that theoretical strength grows with the movement itself. Black Panther theory was useful for the world. Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, we've had stuff in the U.S., but I mean, Black Panthers were largely, the U.S. largely silenced them or tortured them or killed them or threw a lot of them in jail on trumped up charges, forced them to flee to Cuba and elsewhere. But yeah, they were definitely on the right track. Do you ever see a vanguard party forming here in the Imperial Core? Yeah, I'm sure we're paving the road for it, but I'm not sure if I'll see it in my lifetime. Just curious your thoughts. I think we will, and I think you're 100% right. Like, I'm in CPUSA, but obviously right now that doesn't constitute anything like a vanguard party. But yeah, my buddy, who's like, he's now worked his way up pretty high in the unions, organizing a bunch of people in this blue collar industry that he works in. My buddy's a communist, Marxist. He's like, he said what you said. We're laying the basis for a vanguard party to come about, right? We need to get workers organized. We need to get the working class thinking about themselves as a class. We need to get people engaged in mass struggle, and then a vanguard party can be produced or can come about out of one of the existing parties, which actually represents those workers' interests and which, workers feel compelled to join. If I want to get active politically, I'm going to join that Communist Party. It could be one of the parties we currently have already, PSL or CPUSA. They'll have to undergo some change. They'll have to get better. They'll have to get more democratic, more connected to the actual masses. But that could definitely happen. So yeah, I agree. All you need is Lenin and a shotgun, I guess. Okay, let's get back to our stream plan here. We have a U.S. I don't know who this is. Some U.S. military. It's a U.S. commander. And they're talking about Venezuela, and this is from Saskatchewan News, which I believe is in Bolivia. They're talking about how rich Latin America is in resources in lithium, which, of course, Elon Musk, after the CIA coup in Bolivia that happened under the Trump administration, Elon Musk tweeted at somebody who called him out for trying to steal Bolivia's lithium and said, "We'll coup whoever we want, deal with it." So now that has kind of gotten famous. people kind of know that the U.S. was after lithium and these other precious resources in Bolivia, and that's always what they've been after in Latin America. So here's them openly admitting it, because I guess the U.S. empire is just completely given up on being covert. They just are openly admitting all this stuff now.
Region is so rich in resources, rare earth minerals, lithium. The lithium triangle is in this region. There are a lot of things that this region has to offer. The Belt and Road Initiative, 21 of the 31 countries are signatories. Over the last 5 years, 2017 to 2021, investment over 50 billion. I think it might be even closer to 100 billion of Chinese investment in this region. I think they're playing chess. Russia is also prevalent in this region, and I think they're playing checkers. I think they're there to undermine the United States. They're there to undermine democracies, and they all mean business. Whether they're playing chess or checkers, they're there to undermine democracy. And quite honestly, with all of the disinformation and the Russia Today, Espanol, Sputnik Mundo, over 30 million followers on Russia or on social media. I mean, this is very concerning.
Cope.
We have a lot of important elections
Cry about it.
coming up or just happened. And we have to continue to stay engaged and concerned with this region.
We have to stay engaged with this region. We have to. They're undermining democracy. They're undermining democracy in Bolivia, and they're going to take our lithium. Undermining democracy, huh? Like in 2019, when the U.S. backed Janine Áñez, a far-right anti-indigenous extremist who had less than 10% support among the Bolivian people, around 5% support. That's what democracy is. When you overthrow the democratically elected government of Evo Morales and put in power a right-wing violent extremist who comes to power violently via violence in the streets and mobilizing right-wing sectors of the Bolivian military to oust Evo Morales, forcing him to seek or go into exile in Mexico, and then start killing trade unionists and left-wing socialist leaders, because that's what the U.S.-backed government in Bolivia did. Rest in peace to Orlando Gutierrez, the socialist trade unionist who was murdered by the right-wing gangs who the U.S. used to do this coup in Bolivia. That's what you call democracy. And when China's Belt and Road Initiative gives Bolivia very similar financing to what the U.S. gave to their allies in Western Europe at the end of World War II with the Marshall Plan, when China tries to do that with their allies in Latin America and build up their allies, that's undermining democracy. Of course it is, because the U.S. wants that lithium, right? The U.S. wants the fascist anti-indigenous dictatorship in power, or a liberal democracy that allows Western transnationals to pillage Bolivia and leave the whole country poor and, murder and overthrow anybody who tries to change that. China doesn't want that. China is giving Bolivia financing at very low interest via the Belt and Road Initiative, so Bolivia can develop their productive forces, use that lithium that's in the ground on themselves. I'm sure China will have access to some of that lithium via trade, but mostly allowing Bolivia to increase their productive forces and use their own resources to develop themselves, unlike imperialism, which robs countries of their resources and holds their productive forces from developing. China is allowing Bolivia to do that so Bolivia can produce more and trade with China. And China will have a trade partner for years to come, which is what the Marshall Plan did in Western Europe for the U.S. As the U.S. and their Western European allies have tried to hold every other country in the world in extreme poverty so they can exploit the crap out of them. But robbing countries, overthrowing their governments, putting undemocratically elected fascist dictators in power, that's upholding democracy, right? As long as it gets us that lithium. Undermining democracy, that's helping countries develop themselves, helping countries become economically sustainable, helping countries feed their people. Democracy equals sanctions, starving people. Undermining democracy equals financing to help people build themselves up and not starve anymore. Democracy equals starvation, according to the empire, I guess. It's so easy for us anti-imperialists to see through their BS. It is, because, they just say it. They just say it. This area is full of lithium. China's trying to do the Belt and Road Initiative here. We need to go in there and make sure they don't undermine democracy. They just said it right there. There's code words, right? If you're an anti-imperialist, you know how to parse through these code words, but they're saying it out in the open. The resources that they want are lithium for the most part. China is doing stuff the U.S. doesn't want with their Belt and Road Initiative because that develops Bolivia and allows them to control their own resources and become a strong country and a competitor on the global markets with the U.S. Sometimes the U.S. will just bomb countries' productive forces because they're becoming competitors, like Yugoslavia. And, the U.S. needs to go in there before China undermines democracy. And of course, democracy, like I said, is basically a code word for U.S. dictatorship or for starvation, for U.S. control, total multinational control of an area. So it's really the opposite of democracy, funny enough. But, there are code words that the U.S. commanders use when they go on media, and U.S. commanders and U.S. generals do this all the time. They go on CNN and Fox. They use code words, but their code words are so easy to parse through if you're an anti-imperialist or if you're experienced in analyzing this kind of BS at all. Democracy equals comprador government, pretty much. Eddie, been binging your podcast from work. I've been loving it. Awesome. Thank you. I'm so glad. We don't upload podcast episodes super frequently because they take a lot of planning. And we've been doing these streams more so now. But yeah, I'm glad you like the podcast. I don't know what our next episode will be. We've got some more planned though. I promise you. Hello, Eddie and comrades. Hello. National interest. North Korea sitting on 10 trillion in minerals that it can't afford to extract. No way. Is that because they don't have the productive capacity to extract them? I'm surprised China hasn't helped them with that. Unless that's just the propaganda article, but no matter what happens, America has an ace in the hole with Afghanistan. If all else fails, another war in Afghanistan for that mineral wealth. And I mean, imperialism, like I was reading Parenti's imperialism earlier, and this will transition into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is like how capitalist imperialism works specifically. But Parenti's book about Julius Caesar, which I'm grabbing right now, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, People's History of Ancient Rome, they talk about Roman imperialism, and like a lot of the times the wealthiest people in Rome had to fund these conquests, had to fund the military, buy troops and buy weapons to go take over someplace. And then the rich people who funded that conquest would get most of the booty, right? Most of what the material wealth that was stolen from this place. But they still had to fund the campaigns, right? They had to take some sort of a financial risk before doing violent imperialist acts. Nowadays, with the formation of the military-industrial complex at the end of World War II, the capitalists, or at least a segment of the capitalists, are making money with these wars. There's a total inversion of imperialism that happens with capitalist imperialism and with the commodification of weapons and the production of weapons. So you have all these weapons contractors, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, who are literally making money the more wars that we have. They're making money selling planes and fuel to Saudi Arabia and bombs to drop on the Yemeni people. They're making money selling weapons to Israel to enforce an apartheid. They're making money occupying Afghanistan. They were making money occupying Iraq. Any regime change effort is going to take some kind of weapons. And 95% of the money that weapons contractors in the U.S. make, some of the wealthiest corporations in the U.S., are made through sales to the U.S. government, U.S. State Department, selling to the U.S. military. So there's this giant industry which would completely collapse if it wasn't for U.S. imperialism. and they have billions of dollars, and they use billions of dollars to lobby the government in favor of doing more war. So this is one of the most harmful parts of capitalist imperialism that's exclusive to capitalist imperialism. That's different from, say, Roman imperialism. There are other, specific elements, characteristics specific to capitalist imperialism. You have financial imperialism. Starving a country out economically has always been a thing, but now the U.S. can enforce it via the IMF and the World Bank, as well as their military. And they make money doing this, or the weapons contractors make money doing this. They make money off of war, imperialism, and regime change itself. They don't just have to spend money on imperialism in order to make money down the line. So yeah, that's something that's specific to capitalist imperialism. Watch out for weapons contractors. Watch out for financial imperialism. Economic sanctions are still the U.S. surrounding countries with their troops and stealing their stuff. It's still, an act of warfare. Yeah, and what country has the U.S. ever gone to and done intervention where they've actually brought freedom and democracy? Right? They're talking about how democracy is being undermined in Latin America or in Bolivia. Yeah, by you. You are the ones who undermined democracy. They had a democracy. You overthrew the democratically elected leader and put a fascist in power. What country has the U.S. ever said, we're going to intervene, we're going to bring them freedom and democracy, and then it worked? Iraq? Libya? Afghanistan? These are countries who were all thrown into disasters by U.S. intervention. Countries which don't even really have a central government anymore. And Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. at least stayed there and occupied them, basically overthrew the central government and then occupied them. And then, Afghanistan, they left them in chaos and sanctioned them, starving people. But in Libya, NATO overthrew the government and just left. They literally just overthrew Gaddafi and dipped out. They're like, have fun with no central government and a bunch of violent extremist warlords now fighting for power in the power vacuum that we left. By the way, we shipped a bunch of terrorists into your country and gave them all weapons in order to overthrow Gaddafi. They're going to fight for power now. And there's going to be an open-air slave market. Sorry about that. Is that freedom and democracy? That's the intervention that Hillary Clinton personally oversaw, and she's very, very, very proud of. That's freedom and democracy. What it is freedom for multinational corporations to pillage these countries. That's the real freedom they're after. But we're talking about the specifics of capitalist imperialism and financial imperialism versus other kinds of imperialism. So I think we should end this stream. We're not quite ending yet, but this will be the last segment here. Talking about Ben Norton or using Ben Norton and his website Multipolarista, which is also what we started the stream with. Sorry, I thought I had it pulled up here. I got to get it. So we started the stream with Ben Norton and Multipolarista, and now we're ending it because we're talking about capitalist imperialism as opposed to previous kinds of imperialism, like feudal imperialism. And we're talking about the U.S. Dominated global financial system. So I think this transitions really well. Talking about Sri Lanka, which recently saw the masses of the country storm the presidential palace, or whatever it's called, basically the capital, in protest against austerity. Now, many people have said, many imperialists, many Western liberals have said, oh, China's Belt and Road Initiative is in Sri Lanka. China must have put Sri Lanka in tremendous debt and forced Sri Lanka into this position, or into this political and economic crisis. Classic China. They're at it again, doing terrible things that the U.S. empire accuses them of, but can't explain how China is actually doing it. But Ben Norton is going to break down here who Sri Lanka actually owes their debt to. It's called a real debt trap. Sri Lanka owes 81% of its external debt to U.S. and European financial institutions, Western allies like Japan and India included. 81%. China owns just 10%. 10% of Sri Lanka's debt, but China blames the imaginary Chinese debt traps. So what have I been telling y'all? We've been talking about the Belt and Road Initiative a lot because a lot of people say it's debt trapping. It's imperialism. It's China doing the exact same thing that the IMF and the World Bank have been doing. But I said, no, the same interest rates on these developmental loans that China is giving these countries are what the U.S. gave to their Western European allies during the Marshall Plan. World War II had created a lot of destruction in Europe. The U.S. wanted to build up their allies, build up their industrial base so they would have military allies and allies to trade with, and prevent Europe from becoming fully communist and just relegate that to Eastern Europe. So they did the Marshall Plan. They started funding giving a lot of developmental loans to countries in Western Europe. These loans had a small interest rate of about 4%. Right, so you get these loans and you only got to pay them back with an interest of 4%. So recently, all the Western Europe, not super recently, but within the last 20 years, I believe, all the Western European countries were able to pay off their debt. It allowed them to be economic superpowers and self-sustainable countries after World War II, after all that destruction wrought by World War II. And that is the same interest rate that China's Belt and Road Initiative has on their developmental loans. 4%. So whereas the IMF and the World Bank have these astronomically high interest rates and where their loans come with all these strings attached, saying we're not going to give you this loan unless you get rid of the minimum wage and bust unions and allow American transnational corporations to invest here, here, and here. Otherwise, all the money dries up. That's what the IMF and World Bank do. China has said, here's developmental loans at a 4% interest rate with no strings attached. Just trade with us because we want to have a foreign policy of mutual development. We want to have trade partners all over the world. So we're going to help countries develop themselves and build up, whereas the U.S. is holding countries in poverty, trying to exploit them. That's what I've been saying about the Belt and Road. Most of y'all believe me. But now it's proven here with Sri Lanka. And, theory becomes reality here. The U.S. is trying to say that China's Belt and Road Initiative is what debt traps Sri Lanka, when in reality, 81% of their debt is owed to the IMF, World Bank, and other Western financial institutions. And China is trying to build this country up and save them from this economic crisis that's been induced on them, been forced upon them by imperialism, by these giant Western economies. So facing a deep economic crisis, Sri Lanka government resigned. Numerous Western political leaders and media outlets blamed Chinese debt trap, although it has been thoroughly debunked by mainstream academics. And that's what's kind of frustrating about this. Some people still don't believe me when I say this about the debt trap. Like Yanis Varoufakis said that China has been non-interventionist, that they're not doing debt trapping. He's like a Greek social democrat. He's a social democrat from a European country. He's not even a communist. He's not even pro-China, but he admits that the Belt and Road is not a debt trap, the same way the World Bank and IMF are. So that's been debunked by all sort of even mainstream academics, even anti-China academics. Sri Lanka has a history of struggling with Western debt burdens, as do most countries in the global South, because IMF and World Bank structural adjustment loans have been imposed on most countries. Those are the main things that Thomas Sankara and Muammar Gaddafi were arguing against when they came to power in Africa. Of course, both those leaders were killed by Western regime change efforts because they were calling out the IMF and the World Bank because they were right. Structural adjustment programs clearly have not worked. They've given Sri Lanka's economy, it's put them in this much debt. So here's a graph summarizing their foreign debt. 47% market borrowings, 13% with, I believe the Asian Development Bank is actually like a Japanese US controlled bank, if I remember correctly. World Bank, India, and of course these market borrowings are mostly Western loan agencies, and 10% to China, which that 10% is probably being invested in a lot more productive stuff than any of these U.S. loans, which are probably just invested in setting up export capital for transnational corporations and racking up the debt. Top holders of their debt, BlackRock. BlackRock owns everything in the U.S. This is one of those conglomerates, those investment groups that just manages wealth for a bunch of wealthy shareholders. JP Morgan Chase, U.S. bank, Germany-based bank, Britain-based bank, Switzerland. Oh, you got to have those wonderful Scandinavian socialist countries helping out with imperialism somehow, right? The Asian Development Bank and World Bank are thoroughly dominated by the United States. Ooh, I got that right. Yay. I'm not the best when it comes to memorizing every financial institution around the world, but there are these different financial agreements and banks that the U.S. has set up around the world that it's in total control of, that help the U.S. enforce imperialism and wage financial warfare against their enemies. The Asian Development Bank is one of those. So yeah. Sri Lankan economic crisis driven by neoliberal policies, inflation, corruption. Yep. I mean, it's taken a while, like in the US, where we were drowning in the wealth of so many other countries that we had been robbing for years, right? Like we have a lot of consumerism. There are a lot of trade routes that come through the U.S. It is a wealthy country, largely from the wealth that we've stolen from other countries. But, in the U.S., some of us could be tricked into this Milton Friedman trickle-down economics nonsense, right? Just, let all the rich people have the money and eventually it'll trickle down. Some people were tricked into believing that because the U.S. has been the richest country in the world for a while. But now in countries like Colombia or countries like Sri Lanka, or these other countries that have been controlled by Western financial institutions, by the IMF and World Bank, and have implemented trickle-down. And in Ecuador, where we've seen mass protests. Honduras is another one. Socialist just won election. People are seeing trickle-down doesn't work. Trickle-down doesn't work at all. Of course it doesn't work. Trickle-down is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard in my life. Let's give all the money to the rich people and eventually it'll come to us. Of course not. They're just going to hoard it and use it to accumulate more and more wealth. But because of imperialism, some Americans have been tricked into believing this nonsense. But really, what neoliberalism is, what trickle down is what I said: give everything to the rich people, take from the poor and give to the rich. And now, after 40 plus years of Reagan Thatcher neoliberalism, of trickle down all around the world, enforced by the U.S. empire, countries are revolting. Countries are realizing this does not work. The masses are in poverty. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And this is not the way it has to be. We don't have to do this because the U.S. said this is the only way that works, because we have to adhere to the invisible hand. Milton Friedman told us so. No, Milton Friedman was full of shit. He was being funded by the bourgeoisie to try and steal all the resources from poor people and from working people and from the masses. They've always been full of shit. And now, with economic and political crises like we've seen in Colombia, Honduras, Sri Lanka, that is being proven. Years and years and years of giving all the resources to the rich people at the expense of the poor people has not worked for anybody except for a handful of oligarchs. And now people are pissed about it. And that's why you're seeing uprisings everywhere. And that's why we have to get organized, educate ourselves, read socialist theory to your friends. If you have a pregnant wife, get socialist theory and read it to her belly. This is how we will make the future. And it will be the future of the toiling masses. It will not be the future of the lazy, parasitical oligarchs. We just have to make it that way, comrades. All right, yo. I'm out. Meme, why do you have Amazon Prime while homeless? Huh? What has been going on in the comments right now? All right. Thank you all for hanging out. Hopefully none of you are homeless, but if you are, hopefully at least you have Amazon Prime. much love to you all. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for talking with me and Carlos. We really appreciate your support. Thank you for the super chats and for all that. And I'm terrible at shouting out our stuff or self-promoting us, but join our Discord. Our Discord server is open and public. You can find it in our link tree. And then also, if you want to support us, patreon.com/Midwestern Marx is the best way to do so. Carlos and I have recently started taking a monthly stipend from our Patreon. So we're officially actually getting, our website is covering part of our living expenses, which is really exciting for us. Most of that Patreon money, though, is invested in increasing our production quality and in publishing our books and all stuff like that. So if you're into all that, if you want to support our work, you can go there, give us $1, and we'll keep pumping out our content. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for hanging out. People saying thanks for the stream. No, thank you for watching it. Peace.